I'm curious. Were you gonna watch any of the stream? I'm just curious if you'll be able to comment while I'm logged in running the stream. I actually, I'm curious. Do you want to just do a quick test comment? I'm actually live now, but I haven't. I've just got it doing a timer countdown. It's 12 minutes. Um, but I'm just go to your studio. I'm just curious if it's gonna mess up with both of us being on there. Go to the studio and live, or and like find the video and then like and see if you can comment. I'm just curious. Oh, looks like my mic is hot. No, my mic.
Hey everyone, this is Jason Bosch, and I've got a little bit of thing going on with I've been coughing, so my voice is a little off, but so I'm not going to talk too much here. I'm going to let Alison do most of the talking, but this is actually an introduction we're recording to a program we did with a woman by the name of Arlette, and talking about mental health and how the mental health piece is going to fit into all of this. Alison, how does the mental health fit into the Web3?
Right. Well, when I was first doing a lot of my research, the pilot programs that were happening with third sector and George Overholzer were taking place in Santa Clara County, California, in Silicon Valley. And there were at least 4 different a variety of pay-for-success outcomes-based contract programs, 2 of which were sort of early childhood education related. One was literacy and one was pre-K. So it was Strong Start was the pre-K one. And I'm trying to remember the name of the literacy one. It'll come to me. But then there were 2 that were in connection with the University of California, San Francisco, working with sort of marginalized communities, people who are experiencing housing insecurity and mental health issues. And so I've talked about those some before. It's just an introduction to the conversation we had with Arlette, because I don't think I was able to get into it as much. I forgot till afterwards that this was a piece that I wanted to cover, especially because one of the participants in these programs were Palantir, which has since moved to Denver. And at the time, Jason wasn't yet having his cold, so I thought Jason might want to talk a little bit about Palantir in Denver, but I'm gonna do it just and save his voice for better things. But I wanted to talk about the mental health system in California and how it relates to sort of the global surveillance state. So again, the initial program was called Partners in Wellness. It was like an $11 million deal that was in Santa Clara County, California, and it was coordinated through a number of different providers. Third Sector was a partner in Third Sector Capital Partners with George Overholzer was technical assistance. It was done in conjunction with the government. Palantir was the technical support for verifying the impact deal verification. And then it also involved an entity called Step Up Silicon Valley, which was affiliated with the Catholic Church. And this is really important because in Santa Clara, there's actually Santa Clara University, which is a Jesuit affiliated university with a social entrepreneur element. And Gavin Newsom is an alumnus of that school. And so the fact that the Catholic Charities was involved is relevant. And I think a number of people have raised issues recently that the call has come out that all of the funds are supposed to go back to the Vatican Bank, by the end of September. So there's sort of a lot of mobilization going on in the Vatican and the Catholic Church now. And clearly it's a major player in both the humanitarian and development aid space, as well as in the charitable space domestically in the U.S. Among the others, the Sobrato Family Foundation, the Health Trust, there was a whole fund that was underwriting Pay for Success in the state of California in coordination with the Nonprofit Finance Fund, and that's where George Overholzer came from before he went to Third Sector, and then the Irvine Foundation. And so I haven't actually spent a lot of time on this lately, but the entire digital identity system for California, there are a number of tentacles that connect back into the community mental health space. And it's deeply connected to essentially risk analysis. And Jason, that's something you and Leo and myself, we talked about last week, was looking at parametric insurance. And this was with respect to natural disasters. But the insurance companies are very much in the space. And so they're looking at risk, not only from volcanoes or hurricanes, but also risk in terms of community risk from, supposedly communicable diseases or public health, but also mental health issues and security risk. And so like within the framework, as we roll out the fourth industrial revolution and people are being pushed out of their jobs and their communities, the mental health triggers are going to be really significant. And so the whole cyber physical system, the Internet of Things, the monitoring, the data analytics, all feeding into sort of the surveillance state embodied by Palantir, that's going to become more and more important. So, but they need to frame it as that they care for us and they care about our health and well-being, and that this is part of sort of community mental health, and it's linked to what they call evidence-based practice. So this was clearly a major pilot program. You can see this website that the screenshot I took was from the Urban Institute, but all about getting the evidence for these outcomes-based, evidence-based programs. And so way back, well, I guess it's not that way back, in 2019, so a year before all of the lockdowns happened, February of 2019, I had written a piece called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences, ACEs scores, is it part of the Pay for Success finance plan? And ACEs is something called adverse childhood experiences. And the idea of scoring those and equating those to long-term health impacts, both in terms of physical health and mental health, is something that was developed by Kaiser Permanente, which again is one of these insurers that's putting money into Pay for Success finance. And so essentially, especially for children and juveniles, because their mental health scoring qualifications has implications in terms of predictive analytics for things like employability, involvement in the judicial system, involvement with addiction behaviors. Those are all potential cost offsets that they're interested in leveraging to manage the youth, again, for this human plus future. And so I had written about this in 2019. And when Arlette contacted me after I was reading the Skinner book about the Skinner box, she was interested in that had triggered some of her own personal experiences. And we wanted to talk about it. And I said, that's great, because actually I've had this lined up for a number of years. But right now, a lot of the mental health conversations, and a lot of this is happening in schools for children in particular, people are understanding the nature of it being an invasion of privacy and a usurpation of parental rights. But oftentimes they're not actually adding in the piece that is actually a market for hedge funds and risk analytics in the global surveillance state. That there's an imperative of capital and investment behind it, not merely that someone is looking to propagandize and profile you into a certain path, which I'm not saying that's not the case, but there are these other elements that aren't being discussed. So this relates to some conversations, Jason, you and I have had, and along with Lynn, about looking at both Mark Andreessen and Laura Arrillaga Andreessen and what's going on in Silicon Valley, that there are these huge pools of investment capital. And I think if people in sort of these resistance spaces sort of reflect on how hard the lockdowns were in California, how really intense the policies were, and understanding that that's the second largest population and one of the largest populations of children and also people in poverty in the nation, you'll understand why there is this imperative of Gavin Newsom to get everybody into this digital identity so that they can be then mined as social impact commodities. And so you create the trauma, and then you later on offer a supposed fix or amelioration to that. And the money that's underpinning a lot of the early test cases for this is coming out of the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. And that's something that Laura Arrillaga Andreessen has very close ties to. And this is Emmett Carson. He was later pushed out due to some issues around sexual harassment, not him, but on his staff. But this is it's one of the largest community foundations, and they're the money that is moving this forward, moving these pilot programs forward and getting the data architecture in place. So one of the partners, as I mentioned, was the Catholic Charities. And I'm just going to read, this is a quote from an article that I wrote about wraparound services and mostly about housing. But the housing instability is oftentimes wrapped up in mental health, because a lot of the people who are suffering from housing instability, no surprise, also have issues with anxiety or depression or addiction. And so those are closely interrelated. And the Catholic Charities developed a program called Step Up Silicon Valley. And I'll just read it. It says, Step Up Silicon Valley was created by the Catholic Charities as a quote unquote poverty lab to catalyze systems change in the social service sector of Silicon Valley. They've got the poverty lab. Its 1,000 out of poverty effort was a test bed to refine elements of the program, including something called the self-sufficiency measure, which was a scorecard to track the progress of low-income people in the areas of food, housing, healthcare, education, and income. And I think we can look at healthcare as including mental health in that. So that is the cybernetic pathway, is tracking people on a dashboard. And I know if Jason's voice were better, he could chime in, because he's been spending a lot of time tracking Palantir and watching a lot of their videos about the various data analytics systems that they've developed in terms of tracking vulnerable communities in terms of scoring them. So, and then I just close by saying such systems of consolidated data tracking are what is needed for these outcome-based contracts to come to scale. And the Step Up Silicon Valley was working with something called the Community Technology Alliance. And this was a nonprofit set up to put in the technology to create these data-driven solutions. So the next slide is a video, and maybe Jason, you can set it up so that we can hear the sound. While this doesn't specifically reference mental health, I think we can presume that underlying all of this are mental health services and treatments. And this is just about a 2-minute video, but I think you can get the sense, again, in this cartooned way, and you know the magenta in there, of how people are managed as essentially almost like agents, right? Agents in this gamified poverty labyrinth.
On a single night last year, over 500,000 people were homeless in the United States. These aren't just numbers. They are men, women, children, veterans, families, who are sleeping in shelters or transitional homes, or worse, on the street, in cars, in parks. They're fellow humans in desperate need of our help. To wipe out homelessness, we must adapt existing technology that will connect people in need to services that help. CTA was founded to do just that. We design, develop, and support infrastructure technologies for human services agencies at an affordable rate. Our data hub provides instant communication across multiple agencies. Our mobile app collects data on the go and integrates it instantly into the database. Our dashboards give each agency a customized system for collection, reporting, and compliance, keeping the focus where it should be, on the people in need. Simple access to data analysis helps answer complex questions, improving speed, efficiency, and outcomes when delivering critical services. CTA creates a direct and cost-effective link between technology and social change. We keep our services for public good affordable by leveraging corporate and private funding. Our work must continue, because behind every number is someone who desperately needs our help. Your generous support will convert data into actionable information that will change lives for good, forever. Please visit ctagroup.org and help us do more.
I know, right? In 2 minutes, it just is so gross. I know. But see, the important thing is, and this is like, I was having a conversation with some folks today, and I think they sort of imagine that they have the broad contours of this program, like what's unfolding, like it's about dehumanization or it's about, you know, automation. And what I'm saying is I feel like, and maybe others could disagree, but we actually have to know what the implementation looks like and what some of the parts are. And so like the satellite surveillance, the geolocation data, the way in which AI is going to represent you as a digital twin and track you and even have like emotion sensing software on the devices and the programmable currency, and then it's going to all be set up as these public-private partnerships. Like that is the totalitarian architecture of this, right? And it's comprehensive, really. Like they've said men, women, older people, children, you know, everybody is going to be sort of managed under this, you know, cartoon satellite, you know, Skynet system. And it's for profit and for data, right? So, you know, again, there are people in the space who are still talking about the public-private partnerships and the deals, but they don't necessarily go to the next level and say the data analytics are for pattern recognition to train the AI and to train the swarm intelligence. I don't have my swarm intelligence book, but these are the key things that we have to understand, the geospatial geolocation data, and that you're just not getting out of it. So if you're organizing with people and you're saying, well, we're organizing over here to do our own thing. No, because that thing is up, looking at you. And I remember the first couple months of the lockdowns, the Harvard, I can't remember if it was the Business Review. I think it was the Harvard Business Review was talking about macro eyes and tracking health compliance from space in Africa, right? That they were going to track African children for health compliance from space. So, if you imagine that you're going to somehow be out of this, what's it going to take when the satellite, shows up and it can tell your expression, right? At this point, maybe it's not granular enough. It can just tell you who you are by your gait analysis, but eventually it's going to, you walk out your door and they're going to see you, right? These things, the panopticon, the palantir, right? The all-seeing eye. So I think it's really important. And again, this is coming out of an initiative funded by the Catholic Church. So, if you understand it from also, I've talked in the past about the mission system and the system of domination, not as an institution, not necessarily individual people of faith, but as an institutional civilizing force. Like the civilizing force is that you will exist as a line on a data dashboard for the AI to learn you and for hedge funds to make bets on you. So I think this is a really important little clip.
Yeah.
So let me see. So next. Okay, so Telecare was the partner in terms of the service provider. It's interesting, it's been around since I think 1965 and it's in 10 different states. So it was a large provider. I'm assuming they were well connected, various types of service delivery from residential to crisis to community-based treatments. The Health Trust was a major player in that. And the Health Trust was involved also in charter schools. This Fred Ferrer was on the board of Rocket Ship Academy Charter Schools, also very connected with the Health Trust, so we can see the overlap of mental health services in the schools, and as well as telehealth is involved as well. And this is just an image that I have from Little Sis. Again, it's talking about the major players, that it was situated in Santa Clara, Telecare being the provider, third sector being the technical support, and Palantir aggregating all of the data. And, Paul Brest that I'll mention at the end, he's affiliated with Stanford. So this is not only public-private partnerships, governments, nonprofits, and private money, but it's also the academic institutions and the esteemed academic institutions, because that is all part of how that's being sold. So in the spring of 2020, Palantir actually decided to relocate from the Bay Area and move to Denver. And, not coincidentally, Colorado is on the leading edge, one of the states on the leading edge to become a smart state, a blockchain state, a state of Web3, right? And it's I think often being framed as something that will be empowering, unlocking economic potential, liberating, all of these sorts of things. But Palantir itself has very close ties to the Department of Homeland Security and state policing, and they have a whole division where they do what they call philanthropy engineering, where they offer their services at sort of low bono or pro bono to get these markets started, to get the data analytics started. But there's very robust projects underway, including a youth mental health program in the state of Colorado with this multi-systemic therapy, which is the therapeutic modality that was recommended by Partners in Wellness. And so it's called multi-systemic therapy for juveniles. And it actually was used extensively in the United Kingdom, and the mental health services with the National Health Service in the UK, they actually brought to scale mental health throughout the country based on an economic equation by this guy named Richard Layard. And Richard Layard essentially made up one of these academic equations that put a cost offset for depression and anxiety for lost power at work, right? The impact of people who were lost some measure of function due to mental health issues to the economy. And so that's what was used to scale it. And then a lot of those therapeutics essentially needed to capture the data. So wasn't just you going in person and talking to a therapist, because the therapist wouldn't be able to capture enough data for the impact finance deals. That would start to happen through chat bots, through online Zoom calls, through virtual reality headsets. And so that initially started in the UK, but then again, there's also a Colorado program that was funded through Pay for Success in 2019, targeting at-risk youth. And so if you look at it from a risk, like a threat score assessment, if you're going to roll out, the Boston Dynamics robo-dogs and everybody out of a job and haptic suit robotic labor, it's sort of like the tweens and teens. Those people, by the time this all gets locked in, we're going to be in their 20s and 30s. And if those people are destabilized, like, you're going to want to have their number. You're going to want to know how to dial it in and figure out, like, who are the people who are going to comply and who are the people who aren't going to apply. So it's not surprising that these mental health deals are targeting youth. Not that adults aren't deserving of treatment or won't create data, but I think it's the juveniles and younger who are the ones that are going to be adults. Like, they're going to be raised in the metaverse. They're going to be raised in Web3, and they're fully anticipating that that's going to cause a lot of mental health problems.
Yeah.
And so one of the people who was involved in setting this up, his name was Steve Goldberg. And Steve Goldberg was part of social finance in the US. That was Ronald Cohen's firm. And he ran something called Caffeinated Capital. So Steve Goldberg was based in Boston, but he was setting up the policy infrastructure well and ahead of these deals actually rolling out in Santa Clara. And yeah, this is just talking about, this was the Essex County bond in the UK that they were doing cognitive behavioral therapy, and it was specifically created as a social impact finance channel through the Government Outcomes Lab in England. So again, not to say that mental health isn't a problem or that people don't need support, but by creating global markets in risk and hedge fund bets on people's mental health, what you're doing is essentially licensing full-on surveillance, even linked to entities like Palantir that sort of celebrate the all-seeing eye as the future, that's the future that we're going to live in if we agree to live in Web3. This is just another report. They call it evidence-based. New Mexico is also a test bed for a number of these products. And so they were doing a report to talk about these evidence-based mental health interventions and describing models that were already existing. So the multisystemic therapy, the MST, was listed there in the table of these evidence-based initiatives, along with wraparound services, being put out in Milwaukee, trauma-informed care, supportive housing. These are all terms that I've talked about. And again, the issue for me is the fact that what we're going to do is we're going to tag people with digital identities, tag them with barcodes or QR codes. Our friend Lynn just posted something about, Texas sending immigrants to New York with barcodes. Everything is going to be barcoded for the data analytics system so that they can tag you, very likely with, say, these soul-bound tokens, like tokens that they can put a metadata tag on you so that, 20 years out, they'll know how quote unquote effective their program was, their intervention, right? The intervention that they do with a 13-year-old when they're 33 and they end up getting booked because they're in a grocery store trying to steal some food to feed their family, like that's going to register as a tokenized intervention. And they call it all evidence-based because, again, it's about setting up the narrative. And so if you say, well, I have questions about evidence-based, they would be like, what? You don't like evidence? You want random things? You want things that can't be proven? So it's all this false, the straw man that's being set up. The evidence really means surveillance. So when you see evidence-based, understand that it means where success is identified as a narrow outcome that can be tracked as data and enables broad-based surveillance of the most vulnerable populations.
Yeah, Palantir is, they're really setting themselves up to be the all-seeing eye themselves. If you look at all the different things that they're involved in and the data collection and decision-making that they're putting themselves into across the board. And the term Palantir comes from the Lord of the Rings novels. Mm-hmm. The Palantir was the one of the crystal orbs or whatever that could it could see what was going on in other places, and it could also predict the future. Mm-hmm. So That's telling.
Parametric insurance. Imagine Sauron with some good parametric insurance deals, right? So this is just a quick image. It's talking about essentially this the multisystemic therapies. Again, there's a range of options in there, and they're not all virtual reality. But again, they initially make it look like you have a choice, and then increasingly there will be like your options will be narrowed to the options that are acceptable to them and their deals, which will mean that they collect the data. And we know in these VR headsets that they're collecting data on both sides, right? They're entraining you with the programming, and then they're capturing your emotional state and feeding that back into the feedback loop system. And, this is also linked to the fact that people who need therapy, like there's not going to be that many therapists. So soon you're going to have AI therapists, right? And would you be able to tell if your chatbot therapeutic is an AI or an actual person? And then if it lives in these headsets. So this is just from July of 2021, showing where it's going. And to me, there's an article, automated VR cognitive therapy to treat patients with psychosis. And I mean, to me, that would be actually enacting psychosis. I mean, asking you to live in the metaverse and dissociate from the real world and possibly like perform acceptable behaviors in an unacceptable situation is enough to cause psychosis, like to cause dissociative disorder. And yet they're selling this as the solution. And I think this is my last slide. This is just Paul Brest. He was the former president of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. So again, I've talked about Hewlett-Packard is really central. The William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, which I think is now just called the Hewlett Foundation, they were really one of their main giving areas was to create data-driven nonprofits. And then they also created these open education resources to track how lifelong learners interact with digital media, either through screens or eventually it'll be wearables or augmented reality, and to get that data as a playlist, as a programming entrainment playlist. And I haven't actually looked into it, but I would not be surprised if these online education modules would also be behavioral programming, because they are, we know that interacting with digital media is about programming behavior. So whether they eventually have a more overt, less educational option and more mental health framing option. I've mentioned before, and I don't think Brest isn't involved in this, but this is the MacArthur Foundation, which is also was very active in creating the EdTech digital media space, that they had tablets called Adovo that were actually piloted in Philadelphia with a small grant in prison populations. And so what they would do is, at the time with the introduction in the test case, families would have to pay a subscription for if they had a loved one who was incarcerated to access these tablets, which were really just fancy iPads. And in order to access entertainment options on the iPad, you had to go through a certain amount of training or mental health systems on the iPad first. So you had to log your compliance. And then once you logged your compliance, you could access the entertainment. And what was said is prison populations that had these tablets, it was sort of like just a digital tranquilizer. Like everyone was just zoned out on their tablet, and it was very quote unquote effective for maintaining the docility of not that I'm asking for prisons to be rambunctious, but it was a medicating, it was a digital medication sort of platform. Now I think Adovo, actually, you don't actually even have to pay for the subscription, they just give it. So that's what I'm saying, these tablets are delivering all sorts of content with really insidious ends, and people are not thinking about it as military and something like it is that peak level mind control. So Brest, in addition to being the former president of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation, he had positions both in the law school and the business school at Stanford. And he was also a co-director of the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. And that's something we spoke extensively about, Jason, with Laura Arrillaga Andresen, because she was the co-founder of that. So he was working with her, and also with Ideas 42, which was the spin out of Harvard on behavioral psychology and analytics tied to social impact, and the Behavioral Science and Policy Association. So, and in 2015 or 16, he actually did a whole praxis at Stanford on pay for success and social impact bonds. And to me, I feel like understand, like once you get to the space that mental health in the metaverse, which is essentially creating mental health issues, it's about shaping behavior, it's about monitoring behavior, it's about establishing social norms and programming people to social norms, and it's about risk analytics for these larger risk metrics in terms of insurance and threat assessment for people who might not be interested in going along with this new status quo, as well as it's very specifically about creating mechanisms for these global financial deals. And knowing that once they can bet on it and they can securitize the debt on these deals, that will be people betting against people. Like there will actually be, and I won't even say people, because these hedge funds are machines at this point. Like soon these investment commodities will likely be decentralized autonomous organizations. So the algorithms would actually, some of them, be set up to profit from your mental health breakdowns. And that's what's really imperative for people to understand. And, you know, I had a little bit of a sob story with you, like right before we went on, but like we're trying to do this discourse thing and we're trying to get people to be engaged with the material and to be proactive and internalize these mechanisms, because the stakes are so high. Like you might have a sense of how these things operate, but it is information warfare, and the narratives out there around mental health and social emotional learning, people are missing huge parts of the story. And if you actually understood that the BlackRocks of the world are interested in betting against the, you know, potentially profiting from the self-harm or, you know, death of young people, it's an abomination. And, you know, and I was watching it's this 2-day, and I haven't seen all of it, but it's supposedly it's sort of like people who are critiquing crypto and skeptics of crypto. But I've only seen a couple hours worth of talks, but these talks literally are dismissing Web3. They're dismissed. If they talk about Web3, they just talk about cryptocurrency and Bitcoin. They don't talk about the web. They don't talk about digital identity. They don't talk about any of this. They don't talk about metrics or Palantir. And they're simply either ignoring it, or the 2 talks I listened to are just dismissing it and saying it's no big deal and it's not happening, and just to pipe down and be quiet. And I'm not, and I know you feel the same way, Jason. Like even if there's just a handful of us, like when we go down, we were going to go down like screaming like hell about what this was, and advocating that people get what they need, and advocating that these people who are at the most esteemed institutions in our country are not allowed to create a global delusion that we're all demanded to live in. Like I am not going to have any of that. And, it's not ideal. It's simply human. What the stand that we are taking is about natural life of both humans and the natural world. So anyway, moving on. But I appreciate Arlette being willing to have a conversation with us about her personal experience, and this is sort of just an introduction to why that was so important.
Yeah, and my voice was not the way it is for the rest. So as I cut to the Arlette discussion, you'll be able to hear me like in normal sense. Great. Well, thanks, Alison, for that introduction to this conversation.
Arlette and I connected, I think, a bit ago over mail, because you had sent me a lovely dandelion that I bestowed, I believe, with a postcard on the House of Morgan when I was doing my tour back in New York last spring. And then I had sort of my slightly emotional video of getting off of Twitter and reading the Skinner's Box book, several chapters. And after that, we sort of reconnected. Because it feels like so much of this is about behaviorism and social control systems and psychological warfare, right, on people. And I had done some earlier research into pay for success finance in the mental health space. And like after the Skinner discussion that we had, you had reached out and said that, you were interested in sort of riffing off some of the work that what I was talking about with the Skinner conditioning, control mechanism, and some of your perspective on that. So we thought that we just sort of have a discussion about both your experience and perspectives on navigating, this social control world that we're playing in.
Well, I kind of identified with you too in another part that for you it's very hard that the resistance movement listens to you. You know, that when you mentioned that they don't want to hear about the digital, the crypto stuff, that they're very skeptical about it. And I kind of felt the same way with my topic in the resistance movement here in Switzerland. Although I have to say I'm not in the Swiss resistance movement, I'm more in the very local one. But I brought it up in various places because I realized through my psychological issues that started in 1998 and where I'd mostly been treated with speech therapy that was focused on you know, changing my thinking. Somehow my thinking seemed wrong. Okay, I mean, there were some bad childhood experiences which could explain for some of it, but I never managed to change it really. So I was in and out of hospitals and stuff until I finally ended up with a trauma therapist. And he really helped me change my whole life, my inner inner setting. I mean, it was hard work, but it made me realize that when this whole thing started, this Corona thing, I realized that the only way that we can get out of whatever is going on, I mean, now lots more is going on, but we have to be able to connect with ourselves, because that's what I experienced. I could not connect with myself with the directions I got from the therapist before. And that's why whenever I hear behavior, you know, my hair stand up, and the behavior is like at the end of it. The behavior is the outcome of a setting that's all inside yourself. And in trauma therapy, one of the first things I learned is that each behavior has its own good reasons, meaning you don't behave in any way without a reason in your psychosocial biography. And I was hoping that the resistance movement, that the people would be open to this fact, and that, you know, this book that I wrote, that I read back in 2019 about the traumatized society, that they would want to listen to it, because I said, we are all in it, and the ones driving this crazy stuff, I mean, the stuff that you also pointed out, I mean, it's absolutely nuts, you know, what you just read, like from Walter Russell. When I heard I think was his name, I thought, oh my goodness, I mean, he belongs into the loony bin, you know. But
that was J.D. Bernal, but yeah.
Okay, you know what I mean.
It was the same day at the Rome. Yeah,
exactly. And so, but nobody wanted to listen. Everybody just wanted to find the guilty ones and to blame people. And I thought, but I mean, we've been blaming various people over probably centuries, and nothing has really changed. So I realized through my path, I have to first change myself, because then I'm a different person within whatever system we have. I don't believe in system change. I believe in change within yourself, because the main change that I see that has to happen is that we have to be enabled that we can connect again with ourselves, with our inner self, because then we can connect with our outside world, the whole world around us, in a different manner. And from that perspective, or from that stance, actually, it's more than a perspective, it's an inner stance. You behave completely different, and that was my goal. But you know, everybody was like, yeah, well, nice thinking, you know, you probably have kind of too much therapy, and nobody wanted to listen. So I kind of thought, yeah, well, okay. And by the way, before I forget, I brought you up to the Corona Investive Committee very early on. As soon as I heard about what you were doing, I brought you up, I sent them an email, and I said, you gotta interview Alison McDowell, because she has very important facts. But, you know, unfortunately it didn't happen. I brought you up here in Switzerland too, because I wanted people to listen to you. I thought it's important, and I know, I brought it up to the people who would understand English, but hardly any resonance. So that's why I always felt for you, and I so appreciated your work. That's why, and when you brought up Skinner, I thought, well, I'll just send you an email and see if you react. I mean, if you say, oh, well, Arlette, nice, but I'm not interested. Okay, fine with me. I'm used to it by now. But I find the whole trauma aspect and the work you do in a good trauma therapy is important in order to change the way the crisis we're in.
And to me, it seems like so much of the social control it's systems engineering, right? They only want people to be individuals as far as they're individuals in the system, like not necessarily inward looking, like
no.
Individuals that can be manipulated.
They want functioning parts.
Agents.
And not functioning. I mean, you do not function by inner guidance anyway. That's the wrong way. I hate the word functioning. But I used to function for a long time, and the therapies and even the stays in the mental hospitals, they made me a functioning member of the working society, which I wanted to be because I wanted to stay autonomous. I wanted to retain my autonomy. And so, I fought very, very hard, even against the advice from my doctor to stay within the system because I wanted to make my own money. I had always made my own money until I was about 50. And then everything started to crumble, really crumble. And I think I stand for a world where people have a connection to themselves, to the world around them, and act from that point. And then we can connect, and maybe we disconnect again, we reconnect with others, we disconnect. But of course, that's not exactly in the way the system is right now. So, but that's what I stand for, and that's what I want to bring across. How this could happen.
Right. Well, I mean, one of the things that I've been trying to puzzle over is that it's like, how do you become adjusted to a society that is incredibly broken, but doesn't admit that it is broken, right? And you're adjusting people to that society, and you're pretending that everything is okay. And for people who can hold it together or who have access to enough resources to continue to pretend it's okay, like it just keeps being propped up. And to me, as we're advancing in this panopticon and moving towards human augmentation and these coercive interventions, both mental health and physical and smart environments, I can imagine many more people are going to start to fall apart, right? It's going to be harder to engineer people to pretend that it's normal. But some of that, it feels like it's on purpose because they're going to create these profit centers, right, in the trauma. And so I'm trying to figure out, because in the United States, and I don't know how it is in Switzerland, but like the Rockefeller Foundation was central to psychiatry. And actually a lot of the psychiatry movement came from Berlin and Germany. And so it's been structural, at least since the early 20th century, embedded in this system of domination. And so people who often work in those spaces go into it with the right reason, but they don't necessarily know the history or the way in which the mental health establishment is meant to function. Like it's not necessarily intended to heal people. It's more manage people. And I can imagine that's going to be even more challenging moving forward. So I'm not sure in your experience, like how people who want to offer alternative modalities or something that actually does help. And then what happens? What happens if you become aware of how broken things are. And does that mean that you're fixed? You know what I mean? Like, because that's the most destabilizing thing for those in power. They don't actually want people to realize how broken everything is. You know, if you have.
I think it's not even so much the people in power that are the problem. It's the people next to you. Because when you start to, well, I don't really like to use the word wake up, but in a way it's, when you start to live a more connected life, you cannot shut up to many little things, and you start to speak up for this, you start to speak up for that, and you become a problem for the others, because it seems like it's like the emperor without the clothes, you know. Everybody has agreed. I guess in this fairy tale too, everybody has agreed. We just don't say he's actually naked, so everybody shut up, you know. So, and that's what I feel like often. And even the sad thing in the psychiatric institutions, I mean, I know this now more through my doctor. My own experience, well, was kind of the same. They stabilize me. I don't want to put them down, you know. I'm not. I mean, thank goodness there are places when you're really down, where you're accepted, where you can go and you get help. But I mean, what kind of help it really is. But he said to me, when he goes to a conference about psychiatry and they ask him, okay, what do you do? And he says, well, I do trauma therapy. They're like, okay. So he's kind of even looked down upon in those circles. And he told me he's really sad, because he says he always gets patients where, you know, they're even in a worse situation because they were treated with behavioral therapy. That is mostly used even in so-called trauma clinics.
Yeah.
And that is really sad, because what behavioral therapy does, it just puts like a cover over your wounds, your psychological wounds.
Well, it seems to me that it has a different intended outcome. Maybe it's serving a different function. It's not actually about making you a more whole person. It's about making you behave. It's about making you fit into the system. I actually just watched a documentary about Billie Holiday, and I don't know if you know much about her story, but she was a very famous singer here in the United States, and but she had suffered a lot of trauma in her life. I mean, even going back to her childhood, and she became this very famous singer. But she was also very independent, and but she was also very destructive. So she had a lot of addictions, and the government went after her pretty hard. In fact, there's a really great book called Chasing the Scream, and I can't remember the author, but he details her story. But it's also about addiction, and how it's our views on addiction are totally off. And anyways, but there was a scene in the film where they had an audio recording of an interview that had been done with, I guess it was a psychiatrist or whatever from the state that would, probably hired by the state to, look over her. And he was calling her a psychopath. And it was clear, like she's not a psychopath. She just, she had a lot of trauma, and she was also a very independent person. Like, she didn't put up with people's, she was pretty fierce. But I just thinking about that, how they put her into this category because she wouldn't, behave. I mean, they were talking about how she just was uncontrollable, and I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that's
well, I'm curious. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Nowadays, you're often called a borderliner. That's a newer version. Okay, the psychopath too, but borderline, when they don't know what to do with you, and you don't behave, and I'm really sad. And the thing is, Jason. I didn't actually aim for I want to be together with everybody else. I've never been someone who just went off and wanted to be something special and by yourself. But the problem is trauma work, really deep trauma work, changes your whole outlook on life. Plus, I realize, we are so alienated from so many things. To me, it seems almost like the world I live in. I have to look at it from upside down, and then I see the real world. I think almost everything that I have believed was true doesn't seem to be true. It was just told. Whether the intention was bad or the intention was not bad, I don't know. But that makes it didn't actually, in a way, it made my life with myself, thankfully, easier. I'm my own best friend now. I'm turning 59. I can live this saying now after, in 2020, just before this Corona thing went off, I was at a point where I could stretch out my wings and say, so now I can fly out into the life. I don't just have to somehow maneuver around everything and manage it somehow. And then from outside, there was this cloak thrown over me, which I have managed to get rid of it a little bit. But the freedom within yourself, that's what I was actually hoping that people would want to look at and want to find out.
Well, where I'm at this point is what other people do isn't my responsibility. And you can offer other ways of looking at the world to people, but I've just come to realize that people are pretty stubborn, and we're also we're the most brainwashed. I hate to, for lack of a better, we're the most indoctrinated, propagandized people probably in the history of at least recorded human history. And so at the end of the day, people are responsible for themselves and what they do or don't do. And all you can do is offer up a different way of looking at things. Yeah. And if they take it, great. If not, that's their business. I think that's the only way that you can really move forward and stay sane and, keep moving forward, because you'll be banging your head against the wall.
That's true. Yeah.
So I just, you just kind of have to let go of that, I think, but still focus on, for me, it's not a choice. I have to speak out against this thing. It's not even, whether people want to hear it or not.
Yeah.
Because, you get into the situation where that's what those with power, even people that are well-intentioned, are how do we market this better? And I used to run a film festival, a documentary film festival, and people oh, you need to build an audience. And I was like, no, I'm just going to, tell the truth and try to, pursue it as best I can. So a lot of the stuff that I did was not good in the sense of marketing, what you do to build an audience. And that's the problem. Alison and I have talked a lot about how people are so focused on the numbers, and it's you end up losing your guide, I guess. I don't know. when you go down that route, And that's a lot of the people in the media space, I think a lot of people are sincerely trying they're trying to speak the truth and try to speak out against what they think is going on, but they're also trying to run a business, and the two things are incompatible quite often. I think so too. They conflict with one another. If what you need to do to get your numbers up and to get more hits, you're going to use, a real shocking headline or something in order to get people to hook. But you start doing manipulative tactics, and then it's downhill from there.
So I'm a little curious in Switzerland in terms of access to treatment, right? Is it private and people paying privately, or does everyone have ready access to support. And I'm just also curious about like the state of medical records and the blockchain, because I can see very much the scientists who are working on AI right now, like understanding the mind is their central feature, right? They really want to get at consciousness and the mind and all sorts of models. Like one of the things I've sort of posited is that they want to use different kind of technologies to map different kinds of minds. So they want to map minds that fall within the norm, what's understood as the norm, and then they probably are really interested in the minds that are outside the norm too. And a lot of the cognitive neuroscience, it's always dual use, right? So it's not the same, but they talk about Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, but probably, people who are dissociative, or they're probably really interested in how that works because they imagine that as a unique data set. And so I keep thinking in the treatment protocols, for people who are within a socialized medical system or something and have relatively ready access, how that's going to intersect with the blockchain healthcare and the digital twinning. Because I can imagine there's going to be quite a bit of pressure in the therapeutic space to adopt modalities that magnify the data aggregation. Like here, put on this VR headset for pushing the cognitive behavioral therapy and those sorts of things.
Mm-hmm. I know that kind of stuff is already being done. I forgot neurofeedback something. I think I know people who did it. And in Switzerland, in general, it's mandatory to have health insurance, and our level also in the psychiatric area is very good. I mean, you get access. You don't have to go private. You can go private, which is horribly expensive then. But what I know, what is really, really a problem in Switzerland is access for teenagers to get even a therapeutic treatment, and also psychiatric stay. That is a big problem. And to the other thing that you mentioned, to be honest, I think whatever they have in mind, it's okay. They can map all that they want, and they will probably map us from head to toe and from wherever your hair grows. So, but I think they won't get anywhere. I mean, they will get somewhere with all their measurements. But because see, what they have is, to me, they have the materialistic, mechanistical approach. And they think, that's why they're all about behavior therapy, they think our brain controls us. It's from top down. But our brain is actually the end of the process. At the end of the process, our brain reacts. So I think that notion in itself, to me, is just absolutely crazy. But the problem is, it's most of the people, most of the researchers, they're all in that kind of thinking. Most of the people believe in that kind of thinking, just like they believe in the other narratives. And so this goes ahead, and people, are also afraid what is going to happen when this is going to be put in place, which, to be honest, I thought myself too for a while. But I don't think that, I think they may be able to go to a certain extent, but in the end, they won't be able to conquer our mind. Our mind is much, much more than what they map in here. That's my personal view. I don't know how you see this, Alison.
What?
I don't know how you see this. I mean, I think it's very important that they point out all of this absolutely crazy research. I honestly, I wonder sometimes. I only looked at Elon Musk because at the very beginning of this Corona thing, I went live with a small, he's bigger now, private TV, an alternative channel in Switzerland, because when they did the lockdowns, I said, I got to speak up, because this is going to create stress on people. Stress is going to create problems at home, etc. So I went there, and he was a fan of Elon Musk, and he pointed me to an interview Elon did with Joe Rogan. So I watched that interview because I thought, okay, I want to know what he's talking about. And the interesting thing was, I listened to Elon Musk, and one sentence just stuck with me because he wants to reduce the brain cycles. So I thought, if he wants to reduce the brain cycles, that means, and he somehow doesn't like communication. That's also something he stated. But I thought, okay, so it must be that he's really bothered by all of his brain cycles. And who has a lot of brain cycles? It's usually a troubled person, because when you're, and I went and researched just a little bit because I'm not really interested in him, but I wanted to know a few facts from his life. And I mentioned these facts to my doctor, and I said, from those facts, could you just deduce that this person has issues within himself that could lead to, well, trauma? To trauma. And he said, yeah, you definitely could. And then I said, then it makes sense to me, because this poor man, in my eyes, he's a poor man, because he lives only in his head. And his head bothers him, because he thinks like crazy. I did the same thing until I had resolved most of my issues in the manner that I did. I would sometimes go to a friend to cosmetics, and she did a little massage here, and I always thought, oh, if she could just replace my head, because my head was so full of all the thoughts, So it's not like that anymore. So I think that's why these people, they live in my opinion, they live in a world of complete emptiness of life. And that's why they do what they do. Because somehow they think if they can control life to in their, let's see, their view on life to the max, then they're going to be fine. Because is an issue of a traumatized person. The more traumatized you are, the more control you need to exert. Because anything around you can trigger you at any time, you see? And when you're triggered, a trigger means it sets off an old memory. You have an emotional flashback, and whatever happened, you go into panic or anxiety or whatever. That's where addiction then comes in, because addiction keeps a buffer between the outside and your inside. The various forms. Yeah.
Well, one thing I think about people with a lot of either resources or power, Elon Musk, I kind of like, I see him kind of more as a figurehead, but you think about people like Musk or Bill Gates or these people, or even the people behind the scenes that have a lot of power, and they live their life in like a bubble. You think about it, like everybody, is wanting something from them, so everybody's like trying to please them. So for the most part, the people that are surrounding them are always telling them yes, and then they can shield themselves from things that they find that they don't want to deal with or whatever. I remember there was a quote by Barbara Bush, George Herbert Walker's wife, and they were asking her about, I think the victims, the people who had been, killed in Iraq or whatever. And she says, well, I don't want to, I'm trying to think of how she worded it, but it was something like, I don't want to mess up my beautiful mind with those thoughts. It was essentially what she said,
Goodness.
But you think about that, you think about these people everywhere around them, you can construct like a false reality that they don't, I don't know. So I think about that as well.
But you see, actually, we all live in our reality. And one thing is, we always have to double check. That's why I was from the very beginning, I was against anything parallel, parallel societies and all of that. I was really glad that somehow you, Alison, kind of went the same way, because here everybody said, so now we got to pull out and off, and we set up our own and everything will be fine. The rest is going to go downhill, but we will also survive. And I couldn't actually point out why it wouldn't work, but I had something against me, against the inside of me, because for me, it's always important that I talk to just regular people to kind of double check, am I still in connection with a certain reality, or am I starting to drift off? Because it's very dangerous to drift off into your own reality. And when my last job was for an American company, the third biggest in the world selling tractors, and I worked for the vice president of finance. And honestly, I realized, I mean, these managers, after a certain level, they have lost touch. I mean, they live in their own world, and they reinforce their own way of thinking. So after I wanted to work for a global player because I really wanted to see what's going on there. And after that, I thought, oh, well, if that goes on there, I mean, what must go on at other places where people have even more power? You see?
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, I recently made a little comment on the forum that I set up for us sharing information, and it on the surface it sounds like totally ridiculous, but the comment was, I know things I can't explain, and credentialed people or professional people can explain things they don't know. And it sounds it sounds like ridiculous. It sounds like, what are you talking about? That's like crazy. Like but what I'm talking about is the essence, you know, like knowing in your heart, like, you know, that, oh yeah, like some of the stuff that we're doing around, you know, meddling with life is wrong, but they can understand it from like, oh, there's this piece and there's this piece and there's piece, but they don't understand what it is that they're doing, what it is they're meddling with. And I'm not saying that I even understand it either, but there's a certain thing that I think I understand, and other people too, that have like a different lens, and it's like, you know, you can't always articulate it. Like so much of my understanding about life and the world, I can't articulate. It's more intuitive. But you know, like I still to this day trip over my words, and I struggle to try to explain, like even explaining like, okay, what's wrong with like us moving into this cybernetic smart city, you know, digital space where our lives are, even just money itself, tokens, like what's wrong with having life mediated by a legal fiction? It's not always easy to articulate that, but like I know it, like there's things that I just know in my being and I can't, I know it sounds crazy, but you know.
No. I mean, thank goodness. And you know, Alison, the work that you do, especially also when you do these site visits, I mean, I really appreciate you guys driving through the snow. I thought, oh God. But it's so important, you know, because that's what I did from the individual to the society level. In your individual story, you actually see what foundations you built your behavior on, your way of treating yourself. And then you change the foundations. You do all kinds of work around it. And you do the same thing on the other side, meaning you go to, where was it, in Virginia somewhere with those cannons. And you drew, you know, you made the connection to today, where we are today now. You know what I mean? I don't have very good words right now. So
I think it's about telling stories. Like I know like the concrete reality, but we live inside of stories. And I mean, the challenge is when you live most of your life in a certain story, and then you start to see cracks or inconsistencies, and then they get bigger. And then you realize you maybe have to grow into a different story. And I think, you know, I'm probably one of the last, I mean, I know you're younger than me, Jason, so I don't want to like cast you in this year, maybe different, but like the digital, like the people who've grown up in primarily the digital world, the children, like, I mean, I know for sure my child who's in their early 20s, that's, they're not supposed to have an imagination. You're not supposed to be able to create in your own mind a different reality. You're supposed to, maybe you can pick and choose from the media that's been given to you and the content, but you're actually, there's like a palette you're supposed to choose from of the story, the narrative story. And you're suppressed from even like reading books, right? You don't, kids aren't encouraged to read books anymore. You're not encouraged to paint or do art. And I saw that, like the education that I got, and I know compulsory education has its own issues, but there was a sense of creativity, our potential, and a potential to be different, or create a reality. And I think, you know, for the people who are in their 30s and maybe before that, that has been erased or attempted to be erased from their experience, and for them to not have confidence in their ability to do that. And so then if you start to break apart the story that surrounds your life, I would say at this point, a majority of people don't have the confidence, not that they're not capable, but they don't know it inside that they could build a different story, like that they could actually do it. And so they tend to sort of hunker down in the collapsing story and try to like not look at the cracks, rather than to sort of walk out and say, you know, I deserve a better story, or we can let me find some friends. And, you know, my friend Cliff, we talk about like going down to the basement. Let's go look and see what this thing is, but it's okay. Like we've got flashlights and a blanket for it, and we can sit down there together. And yeah, maybe it's scary, but we could build something different once we face it. And I think that's the behaviorism, that's the penalties, that's the undercutting people's confidence. And it's,
well, that
it's
comment
sad.
you said, the little girl, one of the videos that I watched from the other day, you'd made your little dolls, and you had mentioned a little girl was like, "Oh, what's that?" And you were like, "Oh, I made these," and she was like, "You made those?" and you said that she said that she'd never made anything, which is kind of wild to think about.
And you
So
remember you showed us. Yeah, and you showed a clip with the children, the teacher, and then the children on the computer. I forgot where it was, but that made me so sad. You know, I mean, these children are all eager. Of course, the computer fascinates them at the beginning. It's something new, you know. But I think, wow, my goodness, children shouldn't be let loose on those computers until a later age. We should learn the use of computer. It's part of our life. I have no problem with that. But I mean, does it have to start at such an age and in such a way, you know? And by the way, I put this book, I only have it in German. I realized later, why do I have to hold it? So this was written in 1986. Yeah. And Mind Over Machine, by this, he was a professor at Harvard, I think. I'm not sure, to be honest. But anyway, what he made me realize is when people learn by computers, because computers can only go to a certain level because it has to do with the patterns and the rules. And he actually outlined the steps you take until you're an expert. I mean, not an expert like the Corona expert, but an expert, a craftsman. I would say a craftsman. Yeah. And the craftsman, in the end, he doesn't go by any rules anymore because he has those rules internalized. He lives the rules and he makes intuitive decisions. And the computer is always stays on the level of patterns and rules. So those children actually cannot go beyond a certain level, you know, and that made me. I had just reread this again, and when I saw that documentary, I thought, oh my goodness, you know, that's what's going to happen. And by the way, I lived in the States from 1983 until 1988, and already then, I'm sorry to say, I was astonished at how little the people actually knew about the world, you know. I mean, I had hardly any political discussions with anybody. I couldn't have them because they had no idea. I mean, I was asked like if you could ice skate on the glaciers, and that was a serious question. I thought this person is joking. I said, ice skating on the glaciers. At that time, we still had the Iron Curtain, and they were not even sure if Switzerland maybe was behind the Iron Curtain. I mean, they had no clue, you know. Yeah. And I thought, Jesus, I was a bit shocked, you know. Nice. I like the people. I like the American people. I was very comfortable with them. But it made me kind of sad. Also, the media, even at that time, I thought, I mean, there wasn't really any good media. What's the situation now? I mean, it's bad at our.
Oh yeah, it was as bad as it was back then. It's like 100 times worse now. It was actually more sophisticated back then, which is kind of crazy because it wasn't very sophisticated back then.
Yeah. And I think that's so sad because people deserve more. People have. Each and every person has a gift within themselves, and it's gonna eliminate the access to develop your gifts. And unfortunately, I forgot in which of the many books that I read about it is that Germany took over many of the education programs from the States, and they have they notice certain like dumbing down of their pupils. And now Switzerland is starting to follow too, and in our news, the most important thing nowadays seems to be that every pupil has a laptop. I mean, that's of utmost importance. And
because it's the data economy.
Yeah.
And I would say that, one of the conversation that we were having about Musk or individuals, I mean, I think it's important to understand that the structure, like the economic structure, this global, because it's run by multinational corporations, right? At the finance, defense, military, is that's what's driving this transition. And then increasingly, it's not even going to be computers. It's going to be Web3. The internet's going to come out of the machines and it's going to be everywhere. And, I've had some frustration lately in conversations around blockchain and crypto in that the conversation keeps getting limited to finance and not understanding smart contracts and the web, right? It gets hijacked into fraudulent crypto, or it gets hijacked into energy intensive crypto, or it gets hijacked into these things which, yes, are true, but really that should be the subset of saying, are we going to live in a panopticon, right? Are we going to live where our bodies, not just humans, but all of nature resonates to a satellite system? Because that's where they want to take us is, where you don't get your mental entrainment through a device, but literally it's a carrier wave frequency. And that's, I don't know how much time we have before that happens, but that's being driven by, I think, both the financial markets of making profit and also the need to get the AI data sets, because they're building this. When you talk about parallel worlds, the metaverse is the parallel world. Like that is the new empire that I keep trying to convey to people. And there's an economic imperative and a military imperative to build it, to build our twins. And to me, that's almost like asking people to become dissociated. Like we're literally, if you're going to exist with a digital twin and a panopticon, that's asking the world to live under a condition of dissociative disorder and normalize it like it's totally normal. And
but
maybe we've always...
Yeah,
go ahead.
Sorry. But our regular, I mean, there's a good therapist in Switzerland. His name is Franz Renkli. And he does a lot of pre, peri, and postnatal therapy work. And he said that our Western civilization, by the way we already go about conceiving, pregnancy, and birth, we are already on a level of dissociation, just in general. And when I read the book, I think you can probably also get in English, The Secret Life of Trees. I don't know if you've heard about it. And when I read that book, I always thought when I looked at our forests, they were pretty natural. They're far away from being natural. They're all grown. I didn't realize that, So, and when I was listening to you, I had these pictures, and when I walk by a bus station or at the train station, and I see most of the people, except old people my age or above, or even my age, I mean, everybody's staring at their phones. I mean, we're just one step away from, I don't know how we're going to do it, walk around with these things, or it's going to somehow be implanted or on your retina directly, that you can just switch the channels, all these kind of things. So that's why I think, how do we get how do we get the people to realize that we're gradually being pushed that this is normal? Why do you want to wait at the train station and then look at this stupid tree and listen to this sparrow? You know, I mean, what's a sparrow? Yeah, but it's nature. You know. Mm-hmm. So how do we? That's why I think what I do is, you know, I watch birds. So I was run around in the forest with binoculars around my neck and look up in the trees. And I talk to a lot of people, and I always try to find something where we can connect, that they walk away being happy, because I think that is something. This kind of feeling of connection and then walking away happy because of a human connection, they cannot replicate that.
No, that's true.
And that I think that's a small thing you can do. And just like Jason said, you know, and what you both do and what I do on a very, very small scale is just raise our voices and point it out. And if nobody listens, it's out there in the universe. The energy is out there. Nobody can take that away anymore. And I think that is very important. And that's what I really appreciate about your work, you know, because you put in a lot of work, Alison, with, and also you, Jason, I assume, because I have no clue about IT. So I can only kind of like, when I look at the little sister maps, I'm like, oh my goodness, how did you put all of this together? You know, it's unbelievable how deep these networks are all entwined. And I talked to an organic farmer last year because I came across some programs within Switzerland in our agricultural business, and I called him up. I was all, oh, what can we do? What can you do? And he said, you know what? I gave up the fight against it. I just stand and do what I can do best. I don't know if we have any chance against this whole technical machine that wants to plow all over us. I'm not going to go against it anymore. I just do what I can do best, and I keep on doing it. And it kind of made me think about maybe that's the only thing we can do, and hope that people somehow pick it up, you know. But I know from my own process that sometimes you have to suffer even more before you really take a certain step, unfortunately, you know. So maybe it's still, I mean, for me, it's already gone way beyond, and I can only handle it by spending 2-3 hours each day outside in the forest, running after my birds and look at the trees and feel at home there. But other people don't see it like that. And I think I've also learned that I have to respect. I had my process and they have their own process. But it's very hard when you see what you see too, you know, to just but I think just keep on doing it and hope that more and more people will listen, but maybe it needs to get even a little bit worse.
Yeah.
Yeah, on the healthcare thing, I'm interested because a lot of the countries over there in Europe and the Nordic countries have, are known to have like a lot of funding that goes into providing healthcare, for example. And I know the left here really likes to lift that up, like, oh, look at them, they have healthcare over there. And it's been my frustration is that, yes, I want everyone to have access to healthcare, but it doesn't begin and end there. And I see like just how profoundly horrible the healthcare system is here. I mean, I imagine it's not terribly different. It seems to be globally kind of using a similar model. But maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but like, kind of centered around pharmaceuticals and excuse me. So same thing with education. Like I want every child to have access to a school and teachers and books and good education, but it's not just education for the sake of education. There's a great documentary called Schooling the World about like the type of education that the West is exporting all over the world, and it's a very there's something really sick about the way that even that's being approached. So, how to have those conversations, because you're like, yeah, people are so stuck in like, they're so I don't know if that is the word myopic, but they're so like focused on, we just need to get healthcare for everybody, and it's like, no, it's not just yes, but no. It's the kind of healthcare actually matters. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I just want to say too, on both those fronts, because, I'm in Philadelphia and we're a city, of high levels of poverty, a lot of child poverty, which is among the traumas. And so there are these adverse childhood experiences. They call them the ACEs scores. And that scoring modality was developed by Kaiser Permanente health system, right? So managed care. And while I totally agree about childhood trauma having long-range health impacts, the fact that it's a score and the way that the rubrics are set up, that was done for a particular purpose. And so what I'm seeing is in the education space, a lot of emphasis on trauma-informed care in schools. And my concern as they're developing these digital identity systems that are built into wraparound services with these pay for success finance programs and data points is that, at least in the United States, if you're collecting data in a school setting, any sort of mental health or medical data is less protected than it would be in a therapeutic setting. So if you can deliver the service in a school, you can kind of get away with more data sharing than if a child was in a private practice therapeutic setting. And because childhood trauma has the potential to impact so many areas of an adult's life, like if it's unaddressed, employment, addiction, mental health, all of these areas, they can attach cost offsets to all of those things and almost use the data to predictively profile children into outcomes that haven't happened yet and preemptively fix them, sort of tar them with the thing of like, you've got this label and therefore now we can do these therapeutics on you preemptively to fix you in advance, because we've and often this trauma is manufactured by society, right? Poverty, food insecurity, housing insecurity, abusive education systems, stress in households that leads to childhood physical, emotional, sexual abuse. Like, these are systemic. And sure, people bear individual responsibility for it, but they're structural problems. And so, and then even within the lockdowns, the past 2 years, that created tremendous childhood trauma. Like, if you think of how these children have been intentionally traumatized, I mean, it's devastating, but they created this baseline that now they can go back and they could say, oh, you experienced these traumas, so now we can create digital mental health therapeutics to fix you. And my other concern on this is that once this gets added to a blockchain record, there are institutions that can identify children who are vulnerable for further abuse. I mean, that's how certain child predators work, is that, and adult, like, you find vulnerable people and then you groom them for further abuse. And so my concern is that we risk under in the story that we're telling ourselves that we're going to help these children or these people in need, to create very robust digital profiles of them and then hand them over to institutions and individuals who may not have their best interests at heart at all, either from these financial deals or for further abuse down the road. And to me, Jason, when you say people have this narrow view, like, those are the conversations that I want to start having with people, is like, understanding the economic imperative and the data analytics imperative behind these blockchain systems and behind the data-driven therapeutics that are going to be offered. And one of the things I found most shocking when I was doing my research like a year ago was crisis text line, which is people who are considering self-harm.
Oh, yeah.
They engage on these texts. And the volunteers who do that, all of those conversations were tracked and optimized on AI. And the woman who is the CEO of that firm, that crisis text line, took all of that data, like this most sensitive data, and used it to develop corporate training software.
Mm-hmm.
They took it entirely out of context and simply used it as a data set, and then harvested, like, again, that psychic level of trauma for a profit. And to me, like, that's just feels devastating. And only recently did it catch up to them, and they had to stop using the data. But when someone comes and says, by the way, your text app that's for suicide prevention, is being misused this way, not by accident, but by design, then we have to start questioning all our systems. And then, Jason, you've talked a lot about professionalism. Then that whole thing starts to fall apart. Then the meritocracy falls apart. Then higher education falls apart. And then the civilization falls apart. And people, I feel like most people don't have enough strength in the core of their being to navigate that. They can't handle one or two things falling apart, let alone 8 or 10. They just, like, once the domino falls, it all falls, and then they can't. So they never touch the domino. They just tiptoe around it because God forbid the dominoes start to fall, because then the whole thing falls and they don't know what to do next. And I don't know what to do next either, but I'm like, guys, like, the next phase is the brain in a cylinder and crustacean tools as some sort of hybrid life form. We're not doing this. Like, we have to say stop before we get there. So
yeah, it's funny because I have, friends will be like, everything, we've talked about this, but like everything's corrupt, you're like, and I'm like, yeah, it kind of is. And it's not because, and I don't even think it's necessarily a reflection as much on who we are as human beings, and we've talked about this, like, what is human nature? We're all products of the system that we live in to a large extent. I think that the whole nature versus nurture, like, I think the nurture is plays a much bigger role in, our behavior and our relationship with one another and ourselves. But at the end of the day, when you start to actually look into these things, once you tip that domino, and you start to just be honest, like, if we were honest, it does all fall apart, and you realize that we're operating on really, really, really bad foundations.
Yeah,
and people aren't ready to deal with that. But we could, and that's what frustrates me. It's like, we could actually deal with this. We could actually solve these problems. It's as unrealistic as it seems. If people were just to, I really do believe this. If people were just to start being honest with themselves and with each other, that would go a long, long way. But as long as we're believing in the politicians and the billionaires and these people that just lie to us on a consistently, and do really harmful things. The thing is,
it's also our families and our neighbors, because it goes all the way down. Like, it's if there really isn't anyone that isn't part of it. And I think some of it is also shame, right? Like, the thing that I've tried to, and I will say, I didn't do it well before, like when I was doing my education work, and I did tend to point out, and, like, not all the time, but say, oh, that person's evil, or, like the billionaires or Bill Gates or something like that. And I think that really upset my child. And I didn't really mean it at the core, but that framing really felt bad. And in retrospect, I wish I'd done it differently, but sometimes you don't know until you do things, and in retrospect, then you revisit. But it's, if you can get to the structure, and that, again, we are accountable, but the goal isn't to shame people into submission, because I think that's what we have a lot with the identity politics now and the cancel culture, is that you should be shamed into inaction, which is exactly what they want. They don't want actually people who have a consciousness around the things that are wrong and a confidence that they can figure out a way to begin to heal them. And I'm not saying any of this is a quick fix. I mean, it goes back so many centuries, but at least can start to take steps in the other direction. They don't want people to have the wherewithal of internally to do that. So it's the shame culture. And I think that's what I feel so bad for young people right now, is that either they're living through crises that are manufactured and they feel powerless because they don't have access to resources, or the people with resources feel ashamed into inaction. And so the juggernaut continues to roll forward. And anyway, but we live in the stories, and no one's willing to take the story all the way back. I mean, I was sitting up on this little mountain saying, hey, in 1763, the British said to the colonists, like, don't go over there, that belongs to the indigenous people. And George Washington was like, but I want that land. And, and then the taxes spent to keep them out led to the American Revolution. But that's not the story we ever hear. Like, by the way, you didn't follow the rules, and so then we penalized you. And then, no, it's just a different story. It's you taxed us without representation, which is, a different story, but there's more than one. And for the most part, we're not psychically equipped to deal with holding different stories at the same time and saying, oh, well, there's actually, these both kind of are true, and then we have to figure out what to do with it from there.
Arlette, do you have thoughts?
I would still like to reply to your question, Jason, about the healthcare system, because we had a switch in, I think, 1996. We voted that we changed it to a general healthcare system where everybody had to have basic healthcare. And you know what? Ever since the premiums have gone up, the healthcare costs have gone up. And the healthcare in Switzerland, is focused on the traditional, medicine you have in the hospitals, in pharmaceutical treatments with psychiatric issues and stuff. And I would like to point out too, as soon as you get into the process that I ended up in, which I never thought I would, that I had to apply for a pension for being disabled because of my psychological status. I ended up on the dark side of Switzerland, and I thought, oh my goodness, what is going on here? Because you're totally at the whim of the system. It went so far, and I was sick. I had been in and out of mental hospitals. It's not like I was just sitting there and thought, oh no, I don't want to work anymore. And I ended up having to take a lawyer to get my rights. I thought, what is going on there? And then the letters you get, I said to many people who were in the movement now, I said, you know what you experience as a society, I experienced, and I was sick, because you get threatened, you get sanctions, you have to follow the measures. And I found out along the way they could even pressure you to take certain medication. And I have, well, I don't know if it's lucky, but I actually developed a fear of medications, because as soon as I don't even take a headache tablet anymore, because as soon as I feel like something is changing within my body that I cannot, explain, I tend to get panic reactions. So it has also saved me from a lot of troubles, but it's not very pleasant all the time. And I was really, really scared when I had to go in for an exam. And the doctor at that time, that wasn't the same. He said, you know what, I'm going to give you a prescription. Maybe just take a drop or two in case they check your blood. And I'm like, what? I don't want to take this stuff, And I think that's really scary. So
right.
I always say Switzerland has a very dark side. And you pointed out something I meant to ask you, Alison, actually, two things. One thing, what was it also with the the crypto capital is in Switzerland, or the digital.
Yeah, the Zug Valley, the crypto valley.
The Zug, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And the other thing is sometimes
when
yeah,
you guys
and the Bank of
BIS,
International.
yeah.
Yeah. I know. And sometimes you mentioned something about the Swiss apprenticeship system. Did I get this right? Or what
Colorado,
do you mean by it?
What's that?
Essentially, I was going to say it's in Colorado, the Swiss apprenticeship program. So the goal is to I mean, they want to take the education system apart, and they have for a long time, to dismantle it. And because what they want is individual agents. They want to have, sets of metadata representing people to manage. And so they need them outside of schools now and doing learning on digital devices or in work-based projects. And so they frame this as the Swiss model. And I'm trying to remember, it's the Washington State Senator, some former Microsoft, Suzanne Levine, I think, and Eric Levine. I think Eric Levine consulted in Colorado to have lifelong learning, right? Because you're never going to be done learning on the blockchain, because that's all about the AI. And so you'll have these skills, you'll do an online program or a virtual reality program, or maybe you'll get an internship in an actual place, and then you earn a badge. And so they're playing on people's understanding of, they'll uplift certain case studies like, oh, the CEO of this auto company, did an apprenticeship, right? They started out as an apprentice and now they're the CEO. But that's not how it's going to go. It's going to be jumping through hoops for the next badge. And so that's in place in Colorado, and it's all tied to these blockchain mastery transcripts. But Suzanne Levine, I think, was the U.S. ambassador to Switzerland. And she and her husband work for Microsoft. And they're in Washington State. And then her husband did consulting in Colorado. And Colorado is the first, is a center of blockchain development across sectors and smart cities. But the education transcript, and they want people to imagine, oh, I can be a pastry chef, or like they think these certain apprenticeships are a certain way, but they're not. They're just going to be badges. And the challenge is that this new model is they're very interested in cognition. They're very interested in how your mind works. And increasingly, they don't really so much care about your physical labor. They're not interested in people who can do robust physical labor. They want to know about your mind and your behavior and your compliance. And so these are the soft skills. So many of the badges are going to be, how compliant are you? And this is part of, even in the youngest children, they have these token economies in the classroom for behaviors. And I will say too, in terms of just to speak to your comment about being in the system, there's a book that I would recommend by Jonathan Moreno, who's actually a bioethicist at Penn. Now, I'm always a bit skeptical of the bioethicists because they seem to be some of the lesser ethical people, but he actually has quite a few talks. And his father, his name was Jacob Moreno, and he was connected to psychodrama, group therapy, and sociograms, so early social networking diagrams in the 30s, like who has nodes of influence and how do group dynamics work. And he was working with the government, I think in MK Ultra, the father. Yeah, so the son wrote a book called Mind Wars, and it was about military control of the mind. And a lot of it was actually looking at the Soviet Union and their socialized medicine and the way in which, if you were a dissident, and I'm not saying that the US wouldn't do the same thing, but like also the Soviet Union was a leader in, my understanding is they were pursuing a lot of like parapsychology and research that maybe we were doing, but we didn't get it. But the Russians were very clear about that was a priority, was like alternate consciousness studies and parapsychology. And so if you were a nonconformist, they would often label you as having a mental illness and institutionalize you. And so this was part of the control program. And then, increasingly, I think, again, the Cold War was not what we were told, was not the story that we were told, at least in the United States, and that at the highest levels, different countries had different jobs to do during that 30, 40-year time frame. And maybe the Russians were working on the brain consciousness stuff and we were working on the LSD stuff or other things, but that they weren't all opposing each other at the very top. They were all rolling the agenda forward, which is going to be this satellite frequency based behavioral control experiment. So I just wanted to say that too. But Mind Wars by Jonathan Moreno. And I actually emailed him at one point because, I was like, I'm still like, there's a lot of growing up I had to do in terms of getting over thinking that people in the institutions would actually do the work, right? And I said, I found all of these things with educational technology in the military. Like, you should write a book because this is the next book. You've already written about the military control of the mind, and here it all is in the classroom. And he's at Penn, like he's local, and he was like, oh, no, you know more than me. Like, he deferred, like, he kind of had like 2 or 3 exchanges, and then eventually I was like, okay, I get it. And then later it sunk in, like, oh no, he was never going to write that book. Like, you just write the books you're allowed to write. And so.
But you notice it's always the same kind of thinking. And I think that thinking is flawed from the basis. It's their materialistic, mechanistic thinking. And that's where they progress. And what I learned in this book too, and what I've learned through the Corona crisis, is they all want research money, you see? I mean, so they're all, postulating this and postulating that and who knows what. And I'm sure they can use it for devices, and in the military, I mean, they have all kinds of, what I've read, stuff that they can use. And so I think, I mean, I'm just amazed at, how far this has gone. And I came across also during this crisis, actually completely unrelated, to a philosopher by the name Jochen Kirchhoff. I don't think you can get anything in English. I tried to find something. And he has a totally different cosmology too. He's an outsider. He has his own YouTube channel. He's almost 80. And he says, everything is alive. We're surrounded by life, even out. I mean, I never questioned the Big Bang Theory. I thought it was a bit weird, but, through him, I've learned, I mean, that's not even so accepted either. That's why I said, I mean, what is actually not being defined as, you have to believe this now, and we are going to teach you this, and what's actually the truth behind it, So, and honestly, I've kind of started to go more in the direction where I read and listen to input that supports staying connected to life, to the living, breathing space all around us, the earth, the living beings on the earth, and even outside, that the sun probably isn't just this great heating oven, but it's something else. and I think, wow, this is amazing, So I think, and by the way, I read something very interesting today, that apparently every 2,500 years, something major happens in a shift, a shift in the consciousness on the earth. And apparently we are in these 2,500 years, because the last time was Heraclitus, who brought a totally different way of thinking. And I think right now is that we need to, I don't know how we're going to do it. I don't have the answer either. The only answer I can give is by my life, that I've managed to connect to myself, and that I can now live a different life, that we step out of this materialistic, mechanistic way of thinking, because it's driving us. I don't know where it's driving us, but not to a good place.
Yeah, looks like we lost Alison.
Oops.
Yeah, and on the professional thing, I promoted this guy's book a lot, but there's a book by a guy named Jeff Schmidt called Disciplined Minds, a salaried look at professionals and the soul-battering work that defines them. The title's kind of goofy, but I can't even emphasize how important
Somebody just hit my tree with a truck out there, so I just...
Oh, no.
We're talking about nature in the tree.
No.
I think it's so stupid.
The truck hit the tree.
Oh, that's a
well. It goes a little bit high, and it's limbed up. But these box trucks, and then they forget that they're tall, and they just like pull up to the curb, like it just.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I hate that too.
That's right. No, I was just talking about the book by Jeff Schmidt, Disciplined Minds. I think it's a look at salaried professionals and the soul battering work that defines them. And the book actually is really, I would call it just a primer or like an introduction to the idea that really needs to be explored a lot further. But that wrapping your mind around the concepts that are in that book is I think critical for understanding why everything's so messed up in this world, because it's all about what it means to be a professional and the boundaries that are internalized amongst professionals around. Like you said, this guy is like, they're not going to go there. They're just not going to go there because they know that if they go there, it's going to there's going to be a cost involved, and they know that. Like, even if it's not conscious, it's been trained into them. And I wish it'd be good if more people actually did work around that idea. And maybe if anybody's watching, if anybody knows of the other books that cover that topic, but Disciplined Minds by Jeff Schmidt's a good entry point into looking at that.
Well, and I think part of it is I don't know, maybe not everybody. Like, I used to be someone who like followed the rules. Like I was, I got good grades, and I did the things that were expected, I think, to a certain point, until I realized what it was. And again, I have, I'll say I have the benefit at this point because my partner has the financial security to let me kind of go off and not behave in the same way. And that's not something that not everybody has. And so I'm not saying that, I have to understand my context in this. And that's not to say my situation won't change at some point in the future. I mean, that's just where I'm at now. But we always used to make up jokes like about having the plan. Like, our family always had the plan, like what was the next thing and the next thing, right? And like, what does success look like? It looks like this. Like when you get your kid in the magnet school, or you get your kid in the college, or you go like, this is success looks like this assortment of things, and check the boxes. And that's the game, right? If you do the things, a certain class of people, which was myself included, you feel like you have the shot at the next, you can level up to the next level of privileges, right? And it's understood within the game. And then those in power, let a few people, exceptions go through, right? Like you need certain underprivileged people, a certain percentage to move up the ladder, so that everyone has the perceived that they too could get the brass ring if they all behaved. Even though the situation is always set up with a governance mechanism, it's not like all of a sudden tomorrow, half of the people who've been suppressed for, generations are going to have a chance to go to Harvard. Like, that's never going to happen. It's always going to be a few. So that's the carrot that keeps everyone in line. And so if we throw all of that out,
it's probably good that they don't go to Harvard.
No, exactly. But that's what I mean. The more I look at it, I keep thinking we aspire to this. Like, we aspire, if you knew the true history, you wouldn't want your kids there. You wouldn't. But the game says this is the success. This is how you play. And for lack of having a different game, and if you play a different game, it's like you said, that you have to risk being alone. Like, you have to have the confidence to be an outsider. And most of us are social creatures. Like, we actually don't want to be alone. Even Jason and I, like, in navigating these resistance spaces, we never thought at the beginning that we were going to be some outliers of outliers of outliers. Like, every month goes by and we're like one more ring out, like we've lost more people along the way. Yeah. And I'm like, what? And I don't feel like it's because we're bad people, or we're just not compromising on things, and so therefore we get booted to the next ring out and the next ring. So anyway, I just think that the established, at least within the United States, like the meritocracy, the expectations, the game, everyone is too afraid to let go of the game because they don't know what the new game looks like. And for sure, it may be chaotic. Like, I mean, destabilization isn't beautiful. I'm not pretending that like you destabilize a society and all of a sudden only the good things happen.
Uh-huh.
I mean, that's probably very unlikely. So nobody wants the instability. But again, when the stakes are you turn into a brain in a box with crustacean arms, I don't know what other choice we have to say is that like that we don't agree. We don't agree with it. So anyway.
But I always say, okay, this whole social thing, the one person you're always stuck with is yourself. And if I cannot, I mean, when this whole thing started, this whole Corona thing, I didn't even know that I was going to get my disabled pension. I was going towards social welfare. And in Switzerland on social welfare, we kind of joke about it. I mean, too less to live. I mean, not enough to live and too less to die. And I thought, you know what? So what? I mean, not so what? I mean, I'm scared too. I don't want it either. But I'm not. I mean, I fought so hard and I was totally dependent on someone being around me. I was not dependent on substances, but I was dependent on relationships. I just had my 4th divorce this year. I had one relationship after another relationship, or I married them, or I couldn't be by myself because I was a nothing within myself. So how can I connect with myself if I'm nothing? And I've managed to change this around thanks to the kind of therapy and also the therapies before. I mean, at least they stabilized me so I didn't do anything stupid. But now, honestly, nobody is going to do anything to me against my will unless they kill me. And I said this at the very beginning, how far are you going to go? And my idols in that respect are the Scholl brother and sister in Germany during the Nazi time, who were killed because they were in the resistance movement. I was scared to go without a mask, even though I had a doctor's certificate. And my doctor said right away, you know what, take a mask in your little backpack. And if it could be socially awkward, and then you put your mask on. So I thought, okay, I put one. No, I didn't put it in yet. So I thought, okay, great. Here you're looking up to these people and you're afraid if someone just bitches at you. I mean, they may bitch at you and they look at you stupid, but they're not killing you. So stand up. Stand up every time, stand up, because if you want to, the only thing we have is our bleeding heart that we are not going to give to them. And that's always what I orientate myself against. And, I'm like you. I would like to have a bigger network. My network fell apart because the interesting thing is also when you fall out of the system, like I did, into the darker spaces, you're of no use because you have no connections anymore. You don't know Mr. So-and-so because he worked there or whatever. And I was kind of shocked when I found that out, that people looked at me like that, because I was always a bad networker. I cannot network. I either like you or I don't. I will respect you and be polite, but, I will go out of your way. So, and, at the moment I say, well, I mean, you're not alone. I connect with the trees, with the birds, with a very, very few people. And the rest, I would like to connect. I'm here. I would like to help, but they have to reach out. As you said, Jason, before I was, running around, please listen, look at this, it's all written in here. And they're like, I don't care. So it's not that I don't care anymore, but I don't go after them anymore. I reach out, and when I reached out to you, I would have accepted if you had said no. It's fine with me because then it's not the time. And what I want to say is the most important person to connect with and be social with it is you, and then the others. And that's my guiding. That's become my guiding principle in these absolutely crazy times, because now, I mean, there's so many minefields that I have to navigate when I speak to people. Most of the time I try to talk about the birds and the weather, and I hope they don't bring up any viruses or any Russians or whatever, so or cryptocurrency or whatever.
Exactly.
And one other thing I want to say too is we should also pull out as much as we can. I mean, I'm in the system too. For instance, if I want to purchase certain books or certain magazines, because I don't do e-banking, I still refuse to do that. I pay with PayPal or I pay with my credit card. It's not optimal, but I have never personally taken part in investing. I know I have a couple of friends that look at me, you're so stupid. And I said, no, I don't want to be in this game. I don't want to make any money. I'm participating through my Pensionskasse, pension plan in Switzerland, and the Swiss government who invests in all kinds of stuff too. But I, try to pull out of the profit part of the system that enforces these bad traits as much as you can. That is also something I think that's important. And by the way, we're switching to paying everything by QR code on the 1st of October. And while you were talking about the data and everything, I thought, I mean, that's because when we don't pay with checks in Switzerland, you either do e-banking or we get, they're called payment slips. And before there was no QR code. So now they're moving everything you pay. I mean, even in e-banking, everything you pay now is being done via QR code. So I could very well imagine that this is going to give them more access, to all kinds of data. And I mean, the Swiss National Bank, was it the Swiss or the Bank of International Exchange? They published a small little note last year that they've just finished the 4th test cycle of this digital currency stuff. It was just a small note somewhere. I thought, oh, great.
Well, and the interesting thing is I do feel like a lot of people at these high levels, like you mentioned the person at the tractor company that was sort of oblivious, like in a bubble. Like, I think they've allowed this thing to be built around them, like by their colleagues, and they don't actually know. Like, I had someone reach out to me by email who was in that space, and it just started dawning on them what it actually was. But this person was functioning at a pretty high level in the space. I'm like, you don't know what's happening? Like, you didn't know? And they don't. So, I mean, I keep thinking, I'm like, you've got the multi-billionaire class, you've got a thin veneer of managers, and then everybody else underneath is going to be glommed on together. Like, unless you can buy a private island or something with your own private jet and a flight strip, like, you're not going to be outside of this thing. Like, the LED lights, like the QR codes, like, it's for everyone. It's for everyone. And I, and I guess that's the mental conditioning to society. Will they be conditioned to accept it as if it's normal? And that's sort of the big question for me. And the one thing I wanted to mention when I was looking at your slides that I thought was kind of interesting, like the idea of the identity, like supporting, your own identity versus the community. And also the need to belong and to feel safe, especially for children, like as they're constructing their sense of self. Because I guess it's probably much harder to recover that if you've had that destabilized at the beginning. Because this is something that I think Jason and I still struggle with, even though we're outsiders, is that we do feel an obligation to society. Like, there's a whole group within, like you mentioned, the parallel society that we're going to pull out and just set up something separate. And it's a very, to me, it, depending on the scale, feels somewhat selfish, you know, especially given that there's been vulnerable people who won't be able to have that choice. Balancing the individual, like your own personal agency and autonomy and comfort in yourself, but that also acknowledging that you have connections to society. And then, but even though for the most part, it's connection to a society that has an ongoing chronic illness, right? Like, and how do we navigate that? Because I think there's all of the, you know, the people who are anti-communitarian. So if you even say community, like you're one of those people. Like, no, like we have an obligation as relatives to one another, to the natural world. Like we are connected. I mean, you were saying that your connection feels more with other than human, largely at this point, but we are still having energetic connections in community, however we define it. So anyway,
well, I think the definition of it's really important too, because the corporate or the government or even like World Economic think tank, or, you know, their definition of community is not my definition of community. My definition of community is the people, the other people. It's not an institutional thing. And so I think that's where the confusion happens, is where people say, oh, you believe in community. I'm like, you know, like, I'm not talking about an institution. I'm not talking about a forced or coerced thing. I'm talking about an acknowledgement and a recognition that, that we're all on this planet, you know, and we, you know, what we do, we have responsibilities to one another as well as to ourselves. And I think that's where the confusion lies, where, you know, people just get so wrapped up in the word community. And I think it's been deliberate, the pitting of individualism versus community. Like, you have to have one, it's one or the other. Which one? Are you an individualist or are you a communitarian? And it's like, well, no and no and yes and I mean not communitarian, but, you know, I believe in the individual, but I also believe that, you know, we have a responsibility to one another. And I'm not talking about like creating some sort of governance model that enforces that. I'm just talking about people individually acknowledging that. You know, I'm making an argument.
I think you mentioned an important word, recognition. And that's the attitude I have. I recognize you as my fellow human being. Although I have to say, I'm also aware that you can turn against me, because on the level of consciousness that you are right now, because they're so unaware for whatever reasons of certain circumstances, they can turn against you. You know, and then I'm the scapegoat just because I don't go along with whatever is being decided I should go along with, but I disagree with. And I find that challenging at times. Like, we had a big concert these last couple of weeks over a period of days, and I actually didn't want to go to any cultural things anymore, because I thought, if our culture has gotten us this far that, you know, there are headlines in the news about a possible nuclear attack, as if it was just some kind of, I don't know, fireworks going off, or I don't know. So, but then I thought, Arlette, you got to change this. So I went there with a friend, and then I said, you know what? You have to live what you say right now. I mean, you have to walk the talk. Respect all these people. They're in their own processes. You have your own, they have theirs. And I think that's the big, big challenge. And there are times where it's possible, and where there are times where I'm just so frustrated too, and scared, and maybe old issues come up too, you know. So, but I think and to me, that is love. I don't really like, you have to love your fellow human being. I think this, it's a bit, sometimes it's too much, but
you don't have to like someone to love them.
Exactly, yeah. But recognizing, because, you know, we have almost lost the art of looking at each other, because we're all looking at our devices.
Yeah.
And maybe looking from the heart. because that way I think the word communicate comes from comunicare, and I think the Latin that comes from sharing. And I mean, we're sharing this earth all together, all of them. And to me, the poor ones, the really poor ones, are the ones on top. Because I know, like my boss at this American company, he was the only, he was non-American in the management at the time. He was from France. And he told me one day he felt very lonely. He said to me, he felt kind of surrounded by sharks. He never knew when they were going to bite him. And that was not very comfortable, And I thought, oh, poor you. And I wanted to say something for the Swiss apprenticeship model, because this former ambassador, I don't know what she got in Switzerland, but not what it's about. Because I was also the only assistant in that company without a university degree. Because I thought, you don't need a university degree to be a good assistant anyway. Because our Swiss apprenticeship model is actually, you learn the trade, like you want to become an electrician. So you work in, 1, 2, 3 years, and you learn on the trade, and you also go to school. Like 1 or 2 days per week, you go to school, and at the end, you learn a craft. And right now, we have a big problem in Switzerland because everybody wanted to go to university, because everybody thought only if you have a university degree, you're good, and if you're intelligent, and if you don't have it, you're a bit stupid. But now we're going to lack craftsmen. We don't have enough carpenters, we don't have enough cooks, we don't have enough electricians, whatever, And so I find it very interesting, because it seems like this whole thing is shifting too, because of the circumstances we put ourselves in. And by the way, that's the Swiss apprenticeship model, which I think is a very sensible one, because you remain in touch with the real world, because you work in a real company, you do real work, and you don't just go to university and then...
It's going to be. They're going to do it in a VR headset. Like, that's the next phase. And that's why they're not being honest, is that all of that's going to run on blockchain, which is very much embedded in the Swiss corporate culture and the fintech and the virtual reality and the sensor networks and Lausanne. Like, they've set it all up so that you'll be doing your apprenticeship work in your living room in a virtual reality headset. Like, that's what's coming. And
I also wonder about, I know here we have internships, and also it's abused a lot of times and used as a way just to get free labor. So I don't know how, if your apprenticeship, how that works, if they actually, yes, people are learning, but that shouldn't be an excuse to not pay people. And I know that our internship here in the US is abused quite a bit in terms of just a way to get free labor.
Well, and a lot of
the auspices of training.
There's a push for work-based learning in high school. Yeah. And so what they want to do is there are districts that say for the 11th and 12th grade. So this is 16, 17, 18-year-olds. Like, they don't want them in school anymore, which, again, I know there are a lot of libertarians, whatever, but like, we don't have good control over placements, right? Like, do you really think that a 16-year-old kid is getting meaningful corporate experience? Like, developmentally, their brain isn't there yet, right? And you put children in a situation that they could be manipulated or harmed. I mean, there's also issues of, like, assault, you don't expect a 16 or 17-year-old kid to go into a company and act like an adult. And to me, I'm like, if what we're doing is we're building a world for AI, then what's the rush? Why rush kids through so that they get done with college by the time they're 20 and are rushed into a career when you know that it's just going to be a gig economy? Why do that to kids? Like, why not give them time to actually develop their talents? Like, and because it's not actually about what they say it is. It's not about fulfilling people's qualifications. It's about jumping through behavioral hoops and getting the soft skills credit, getting the behavioral profiles, and getting the twins. And again, I don't think it's going to function the way that they think, but if the goal is to get just data and AI and it's just performance and you never actually get the work, you just get a badge and then they say, oh, you know what, actually this job now requires 2 more classes, do 2 more classes. Oh, nope, now it requires this other qualification, now do that. Like, it's always you competing for a job with 50 other people. And then people who don't get the job have to do some other hoop jumping. And it's inhuman, I think. And that's the thing that I think we have a sick society, and it's going to get worse. And they're actually going to create profit centers on managing mental health trauma and addiction trauma. And these BlackRocks of the world, they know, UBS Bank, Deutsche Bank, Goldman Sachs, they're counting on it. Like, they're counting on managing excess labor as mental health commodities. And it's just counter to everything that is ethical in the world. And yet no one's talking about it as an economic construct. I guess and none of the professionals, because just like the schools, the professionals will be brought into it and credentialed that this is the way it is. And how many of them have backbone to say no? I mean, and then even the alternative treatments, like what I've seen in the US, because many of the people who initially were interested in my research came out of more alternative, holistic perspectives, they're going to give them vouchers that you can use for alternative things, and then it's going to still collect the data. So they're going to rope everyone into it. They won't truly be outside the system unless you have non-programmable money or something that you can use off the side and cut some sort of, dark economy, underground social, therapeutic economy. You're going to have to give the data. And that's what I keep telling all of these alternative health people. You're going to have to be prepared, because at some point, the education vouchers that they're giving the kids, they're going to have a health voucher. And and as soon as someone walks in the door with the health voucher, when you take that money, it's going to mean that all of your data gets sucked back into the system and you're going to be controlled. And I think they don't believe it's going to happen, but I just think it's a matter of time. So,
but then those people who are going to invest in all of this stuff, I mean, it's probably going to be the little people. I mean, we have to learn that we have to start asking questions. We have to question everything. At the moment, we have to question everything. Doesn't mean that everything is wrong, but we just have to question. I had a discussion once with someone from the resistance movement, and she said to me, half crying, but I want to trust the politicians. And then I said, yeah, well, I would like to too, but you can't. So, we have to adapt to this reality. And then also, like this morning, I went shopping, and we have these self-scanning things, or we have the regular register where you pay. I never go to the bloody self-scanning things. I hate them. So I went there, and she came, and I asked her, I said, because I kind of apologized almost that she had to run. And then she said, no problem. I said, you know what? I just refused this apparatus thing here. And she said, you know what? We're actually down to 50% of the people. And they said to us when they introduced it, oh, we're not going to lose people. You're going to be assigned other jobs. And I said, yeah, well, who believes that? So, the elites do one thing, but there's so many people going along with it. Also for this, they want profit out of it. That's why I say I always end up in the same spot. I mean, you have to discover your own truth, live by this truth, and reflect whether this truth supports that other people can live their truth too, or if you can just live yours and the others cannot,
Right.
Yeah, they've been saying that for a long time. You mean actually going back even like late 18th century, as these machines started to come, play a more of a role in production. There was even language back then that this was going to free up people, the machines are going to do the labor, and we're going to have more leisure time, and it's that myth is still with us today. I still hear people, think that, like, oh yeah, we're going to, in theory, there's a logic to it. Yeah, of course. Now we don't have to do this, but you don't understand the logic of the system that's built around management, control, domination, and extraction. It's not they're it's not a technical, we're not dealing with like a technical problem. Oh, we just need to come up with a better machine. It's something different that we're dealing with. So, and again, if people can't acknowledge that or don't understand that, they're going to be stuck.
You know, they did a documentary in Germany, this is years and years ago, about the cheap vegetables and how they're being produced in like Spain. And it's really horrible how it's produced. I mean, even, sorry to say, even pigs in Switzerland usually live better than those people. And they showed the pictures. And the person stood there with the cheap tomato that she had bought. And she said, oh, well, but I need to save money. Off she went. You see?
Yeah.
That's, to me, that's why I mean, I feel like kind of like an idiot because I repeat myself. It's always the same thing. It comes down to each. I think we are at this point in history, each and every individual is called to action, and not to action outside, but to action inside. And then from this inside, I mean, you do your work, Jason does his work, and that's how we are going to build. No, we are not going to build it. It's gonna start growing a new form of community that fits. And by the way, the book from David Graeber and David Wengrow, The Dawn of Everything, where he kind of unravels the human history, also with parts that have been suppressed. It's very interesting how, I mean, we are actually a very clever being, you know. We tried all kind of things. Some things worked, some things didn't, and I wanted to have a bit of a clearer message. I was hoping he would say this is how you have to do it, but then I realized that's stupid, Arlette, because we are so diverse, you know. We have different ways of handling life, but we've had systems, especially, I wanted to actually look it up, but now I forgot, I realized, especially in Crete, there was a really wonderful system in place where people were, over quite a period of time, flourished happily. And you could see this in the output of arts and hardly any military and all this stuff, you know. So there are models also from the past that maybe we could use to kind of get an idea of what to do. But it starts from here. We are the society. We are the, you know.
I think, the internal work, I think, is really important. And that's, again, and the question of the numbers. And I'm like, no, we actually need some clarity. We need reflection. We need to know where we stand and what our values are, and to look at things with clear eyes, because if you don't understand where you're standing, like, how are you going to chart a course forward? And I feel like there's such a rush to do the next thing with lots of people that we don't have a clear understanding, like, in our hearts of what is actually wrong, like what is wrong, and a consensus about what is wrong. Like, even within these movements, people have very different understandings of what they imagine is wrong, so to speak. And, you know, in the space that we're trying to create, you know, Jason has set up, like, that part of talking to people is like, what is your understanding of what is happening? Like, which is, again, a reflection. Like, think about it. Like, don't just jot something off. Like, in your heart, what do you think is actually happening here? And it's an important question. And not everybody's going to have the same understanding, but I think it's the exercise of actually focusing on that is really vital. Mm-hmm. And not looking for a hero, not looking outside, because that's the other thing of this, like, digital consumer culture is you're meant to look out at other people or align, like, pick a society, pick an interest group, pick someone to affiliate with, you know. Mm-hmm. And that's part of what I've tried to push out in my messaging is, like, I can provide a lot of and share, like, freely what I have found and how I think about it, but you need to do it for yourself. No one can do that for you. You actually have to do that, like, invest yourself in it, because your story is different from my story.
You know, while I was going through this process, that I realized somehow it's not going to work for me anymore to be in the workspace. I just practiced return on investment in myself, because I said, I have only myself now. Everything else is gone for whatever reason, what I'm supposed to learn. And that's how, actually, I'm glad I did it, because that way I still stayed upright. And I think right now, you know, I was really scared for a while when Ukraine happened. I mean, you guys are probably far removed, you know, but this whole war thing is very close to our doorstep, and our politicians going bananas and everything. And I said, okay, you know what? You can only die. And when I die, I take myself with me as I am in that moment. So that's why I say, if you lose yourself, and I have lost myself many times along the way because I didn't know how to have myself, that's really awful, you know, the emptiness you feel then. And that's why I say, if you stay true to yourself and do from your heart, as you do, Alison, or you, Jason, I hear it in your voices. It's so interesting, you know, when I listen to YouTubes, I know now by the voices who I can listen to regardless of the message that they bring. Because when someone is connected with him or herself, then you hear it in the voice. It carries an energy that makes me stay connected with myself too. And I can listen to your message. And I think that's really a strength both of you have. I notice it in both of you, and the combination of the two of you, I think, is great too. And I'm so appreciative of what you do, and it's so important. Just keep doing it as long as you feel that's the right thing. If tomorrow you think, no, I'm not going to do it anymore, I do something else, that's it. You've done your part, you know. And it's so wonderful what you do. That's why I sent you the dandelions, because what else can we do? I mean, if they want to, they can come and run over me with a tank tomorrow. They have the means, but I can only stay there and hold up the dandelion and go down with the dandelion in my hand. You know, I mean, that's the reality, and I think that's the power. That's the real power we have, and we should not let that be taken away. No matter what kind of nano, you know, what they all develop, those phrases. Because don't forget, they still have to get it inside of us, and they will not get it inside of me. Never. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Arlette. Thank you for sharing
wonderful
some of your story and your time with us.
Yeah, thank you both.
Okay, so we're here on Blake Street in downtown Denver. As I was looking for places to do field work here in the Colorado area, I had a friend alert me to the fact that actually Palantir had relocated its headquarters from the Bay Area here to Denver. And it's the building behind us. The address given on their website says Suite 250. So it's sort of low key, given the scope of Palantir in larger government accounting and geopolitical frameworks, because I feel like they're going to play a significant role in sort of the ubiquitous surveillance, tracking, social impact space. But yeah, again, it's very low key. And I was mentioning to Jason as we walked up, I'm like, it's kind of a small building. And he made the point that really, you know, discrete is probably what they're going for at this point. And like the future of work is that you're working from your sofa or your kitchen table, not actually in a physical office. So, you know, a huge organization like this could occupy a rather small footprint downtown rather than necessarily a big office complex sort of in the suburbs part of the city. So I thought that was an interesting observation. And then our next stop is going to be at the Capitol, and we're going to talk a lot about the state of Colorado and digital citizenship, digital government, and as it links to pay for success finance. But here for Palantir, I wanted to raise the issue that early on in my research around education, Santa Clara County, California, which is in the Silicon Valley area, was the test bed for a number of pay-for-success finance social impact bond deals. It was sort of a mixed bag. Some were strictly pay-for-success, some were formal social impact bonds. They included an early childhood social impact bond, an early literacy social pay-for-success deal, and then also 2 social impact bonds, one for homelessness and one for mental health. Now, those latter 2, the homelessness social impact bond, which was called Welcome Home, and the mental health one, which was called Partners in Wellness, within the pay-for-success finance space, you always have a third party that does the deal evaluation. So you have an arrangement between investors, the public agencies, and then there are supposed to be certain target metrics hit in order to fulfill the terms of the deal. And so in the case of both of those 2, the homelessness and the mental health social impact bonds, Palantir was actually the third party reviewing. And if you understand Palantir's connections with State Intelligence, Defense Department, Homeland Security, one of their early funders was In-Q-Tel, which is the venture capital arm of the CIA. You can imagine how you have these vulnerable communities that need social supports, and then all of a sudden they become sort of sucked into this data vortex where their lives and behaviors become enmeshed in finance deals that are overseen by an entity that has very diverse interests, and many of them that are maybe at odds of just the general dispossessed poor person that needs the services. So, I wanted to bring that up. The other element, so Palantir does some of their work as pro bono. They have an philanthropy division, and they call it philanthropy engineering, right? And so, again, we're looking at sort of social progressivism, this continuation from the late 19th, earliest 20th century of engineered society to certain specifications. But right now, the specifications that society is going to be engineered to will be in alignment with investors, right? The BlackRocks of the world, the Vanguards of the world, the State Street Capital. Society will be reshaped to meet the needs of global capital. And Palantir is playing a role both in facilitating the assessment of the deals, but then also in implementing a larger state surveillance component that was going to be linked to your digital identity. So I want to mention, Peter, and I'm not sure if it's Thiel or Thiel, I'm not sure the correct pronunciation, Thiel, he was the founder of PayPal. And so a lot of what's going to be advancing moving forward is that my sense is that the pay-for-success deals will be linked in with conditional cash transfers. It might take the form of like a universal basic income or a cash payment system. But those payment systems, it's very obvious now that they're going to be digital. It's not going to be bills in your wallet. It's going to be digital credit on a phone or other smart device, or potentially in some future, some sensor that's in your hand, or biometric tattoo or something. And then the money in those systems can be programmed. And programmed and linked to smart contracts to be used only for certain functions. Like, here's your public benefit, but you can use X amount for rent. You can use X amount for food. You can use X amount for reskilling. You can use X amount for mental health services. And you'll have very little autonomy in that equation, though there will likely be some, because these betting markets are going to be betting on your behavioral compliance. So the money that comes will be sort of monopoly money. And then that's sort of the starter money for the game of life. I will mention those social impact bonds that were happening in Santa Clara County, Partners in Wellness and Welcome Home, also had ties to the University of California, San Francisco medical complex. And so, we talked in Salt Lake City about the interface between predictive profiling of mental illness, of how that relates to social impact finance, illness and addiction, how it meshes with the finance deals, and how it will mesh with wearable technology and potentially remote sensing technology, right? Because what they were doing at the Huntsman Center was they were planning to use these MRIs to sort of tease apart the neurons to identify whether you were prone to depression or schizophrenia or addiction. They were looking to get very nuanced data to fund these deals tied to mental health. So in my mind, that's a problem when what we're doing is we're playing a giant game. Now, I will say the year or so before the lockdown started, one of the first deployments of digital identity in this country happened in Austin, and it was part of the ID 2020 program. You know, everyone has a good digital identity, good ID, that's backed by Pierre Omidyar. That program was called MyPass in Austin. It was funded by the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation and Bloomberg Philanthropies. Bloomberg is also active in the Pay for Success finance space here in Denver. And so what they did was they put unhoused people on blockchain for their medical records. And in that case, it was not high tech. It was simply that each person had their biometrics taken and they were assigned like a laminated card QR code that would represent them digitally as a citizen. So it doesn't have to be something as fancy as like they're going to put a chip in your hand. It could really be something as simple as a laminated QR code, which now like we've all started to become accustomed to, that's where things are moving. So I think we need to consider that in light of Pay for Success finance deals, the kind that Palantir was involved with. And here in Denver, they actually have a Pay for Success deal for the homeless, and it's connected to both Housing First services and something called assertive community treatment. And I'm not totally familiar with that, but that's an interesting name, assertive community treatment. There was an article on this in the Urban Institute's website, and partners included the Denver Foundation, the Python Foundation, now Gary Investments, the Walton Family Foundation, John and Laurel Arnold Foundation. Now again, John Arnold was Enron, Energy's futures trading, and he actually got caught in Baltimore doing sort of illicit deals with the city council to do surveillance flights of the city tied to predictions around crime. So that's part of that. Living Cities, that's a Rockefeller program tied to smart city development. The Nonprofit Finance Fund, which was very central in all of the Santa Clara deals with George Overholtzer, Colorado Health, and Northern Trust. So there's multiple partners in that. Harvard Kennedy School was providing technical support, as well as Colorado Access, which I understand is Colorado's sort of Medicaid health system. Services were provided by Corporation for Supportive Housing and Enterprise Community Partners. And the payer on that deal was the City and County of Denver. It was about a 5-year program that was starting in 2016. So again, Housing First is a model where you people who are in crisis, you get them in housing, and then you try to take care of their needs, which on the surface I don't have a problem with. But if what we're building is potentially smart housing with sensors, with conditional money, with non-consensual services provided to people, where there's surveillance involved and where those people then become commodities in global markets, that becomes a problem. I think that ethically that's a huge problem. Then what we have is poverty and trauma that creates money for the wealthiest people in the world. And that's not going to fix the problems. If you have profitable poverty management, you're simply going to grow more poverty. So, you know, Palantir's role in all of this, if they continue with what they had done in Santa Clara County, will be to assess those deals and possibly provide impact data, I'm assuming, to fulfill them. Now, earlier, maybe like 3 years ago, there was a program that set up opportunity zones, and every governor was supposed to identify 20% of its low-income census tracts to be identified for these opportunity zone areas. And they were for redevelopment. Essentially, it was a way for global financial interests to come in and gentrify huge swaths of land, make investments in both real estate and businesses, and these could include NGO service providers like charter schools, maybe like wellness providers, counseling, various companies, and if they could hold their investment for for 10 years, they would never pay capital gains tax on their original investment, which is a huge windfall. And these are like portfolios. It's really only these really big companies that have the resources to like sit on their investment for 10 years, but they totally can do that. So they can come in, remake whole neighborhoods. There are no protections from gentrification for the local people. And this is very much connected with the Federal Reserve's redevelopment programs, both community development of infrastructure and human resource development tied to reskilling. So in 2019 in Philadelphia, our Federal Reserve office, led by Patrick Harker, with our former mayor, Michael Nutter, who's a Bloomberg What Works government guy, they came together with this Pathways to Prosperity program. goes. Okay, so there was this Pathways to Prosperity program, which was essentially reskilling workers into things like commercial laundries, or they were partnered with Comcast, which is the telecom provider, because someone has to do the wiring for the metaverse and the surveillance state. And so they were reskilling. Now this was pre-lockdowns, right? Many people of the middle class losing their jobs in the lower class and then having to reskill for the fourth industrial revolution. So the central banks interconnected with the opportunity zones are really, really central. And probably a lot of this redevelopment is going to be linked to smart systems, a smart infrastructure. They will come into low-income communities, probably like level it out, and then just start from scratch and rebuild what essentially might sort of be like friendly gulags, right, of social impact support systems. And so it's interesting here in Denver, there's an area that's sponsored by Panasonic. It's out near the airport. It's on the border of sort of a large opportunity zone on the east side of the city. And this Pena Center is on a transit hub. They're piloting autonomous vehicles, piloting smart pavement, piloting smart street lights that they've said will advertise to you based on your personal profile. And Panasonic did a previous city outside of Tokyo. So you can imagine that these opportunity zones would be remade specifically with supportive housing or mental health or services involved, but it's going to be conditional. It's going to be conditional on your behavioral compliance, and it's going to be tied in with programmed money and your QR codes, which we'll talk about later, but your digital identity, and Colorado is coming up with its own, your identity on a smartphone, with you having to show proof of things like your health status in order to access parts of society. And I can imagine these opportunity zones will be test beds. The homeless, people who have mental illness will be early pilots for this. This will be profitable, and they will work out the kinks for the larger program, and that they will then apply to smart cities, charter cities, special economic zones. Essentially with geofencing, it's the Wild West. You can just carve out parts of a city and companies can take it over and do whatever they want in there. And that's where we're at. So anyway, new low-key headquarters of Palantir behind me in downtown Denver. All right, so this is our final field visit of this round. We're on the steps of the state capitol of Colorado. And before I get into all of that, I had a couple things that I forgot in the last video to mention about Peter Thiel and Palantir. One is that Thiel has been identified in recent years as sort of a political rainmaker for the Republican Party, which is interesting to me because he's a Silicon Valley guy, and on the surface it doesn't necessarily seem to be a great match with the Republican Party. But I think it's important to understand that moving forward, the whole technological social engineering element that's advancing, tied to digital identity and what works government, they really need the conservatives on board, because really the last 2 years have shown that the liberals and the progressives don't get that the underpinning of these social impact markets is really very devious and not meant to actually help people. They just listen to the superficial dialogue, that's on your local NPR station, right? And that's on the liberal media, and like they believe and trust people that somehow, despite these terrible power imbalances and the rollout of this militarized technology, that things are going to improve for vulnerable populations. And I can't begin to explain why they think that is, but there's been no indicator over the last 2 years that the progressive liberal left is going to come along anytime soon. So they've got that pretty much locked up for the moment. And then you've got the conservatives who are still framing everything within the context of like liberation and deregulation, and and they're the ones who are mostly asserting sort of buffer zones against the rising biosurveillance state, but they are doing that from a frame that's not one that I share necessarily. I mean, they're doing probably the correct thing for reasons that I'm not really aligned with. So they need educating, but essentially the biosurveillance state needs to pull in the conservatives. And so then in that context, I think it makes sense that Peter Thiel is being that rainmaker at the moment, and that there's such an emphasis within the blockchain and crypto space to be going after red states or sort of purple states like Colorado, states like Wyoming, Montana, Utah, get them on board with this understanding that somehow these decentralized technologies are going to preserve their rights and their access to free markets. When really the free markets are not going to be for your everyday person, it's going to be free markets for AI-driven hedge fund portfolios. That's who the free markets are going to be for. So I just wanted to sort of get that clear. Oh, and one last thing is that Peter Thiel actually purchased he has multiple homes in multiple places, but he did purchase an $18 million mansion in Miami last year. And Miami, in Florida in general, and Miami specifically, are very much aligned with the crypto blockchain space. As is Colorado, like every, different nodes are prominent, but the Learning Economy Foundation, their test lab for digital education and human capital finance, one of the test beds is here, C Lab in Colorado, and then the other one is actually in Broward County, which is sort of just outside of Miami. So Miami is sort of the crucible for a lot of the blockchain space and a launching pad for what's happening in Central America and Latin America in that space. So that's sort of just a continuation on the last, my last visit. So the thing that I talk about a lot that most people don't is this pay for success finance. And I'm sure a lot of people might be like, yeah, it's just one of like so many different kinds of legislation out there. Like, why is this piece important? It doesn't seem that important to me, given all that's underway. And, I gave a speech last summer in Tucson about smart cities and social impact finance and Internet of Things sensors, and how really what appears to be underway is the creation of a mixed reality video game where poor people are used as game pieces in this global financial market. And then ultimately the data will be used to attempt to catalyze the singularity and train the robots and perhaps feed into this Julius Stillman's World Institute Global Brain Project. As crazy as it sounds, that appears to be the way it's going. So pay for success is the parameters linked to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and digital identity. That's the through line. So the UN SDGs are the goals, that those are the rules of the game, and pay for success are sort of the terms of engagement in the game. And then we've got the digital identity that identify you as a character in the game. And so pay for success finance has to happen first. Those policies, the enabling legislation has to happen. The Social Impact Partnerships Pay for Results Act, that gave seed money to start that going. And here in Colorado, Pay for Success legislation was passed in 2015. I think they initially started in 2014, they got some pushback, and then they moved to 2015. So that passed, and I'll just read off the representatives who were attached to that bill: Garnett and Rankin, Arndt, Becker, Duran, Fields, Hammer, Lee, Contine, Moreno, Pabin, Rosenthal, Roop, Salazar, Thurlow, Vigil, Williams, Winter, and Hullinghorst. And those are the reps. And then the senators were Johnston, Martinez, Humerick, Aguilar, Heath, Hill, Kefalas, Kerr, Scheffel, and Kaldman. And then it was signed into made active by Governor Hickenlooper at the time. And a major force behind that legislation were a group that were identified as Democrats for Education Reform. And in the hat that I was wearing early in my activism, I would say, these are people who want to privatize public education. But what I'm realizing is that really it's about turning vulnerable populations into these impact commodities, and this includes children. So, as much as we were positioned to fight the education privatizers at the time, it's not really a fight between parents of charter schools and parents of public schools and parents of Catholic schools, because ultimately, through digital identity and choice vouchers and standardized curriculum, the plane will be leveled across the board, and all of the children will become these impact commodities trained to be digital citizens of the fourth industrial revolution. So it's important to know that Jared Polis, when he was still a senator, he was the one, there's an article from America Forward that was asserting getting pay for success provisions into the reauthorization of the ESEA, and that's the Every Student Succeeds Act. And that's vital. It feels like somewhat of a small footnote off to the side. But once that was embedded, now the whole education system, as well as support services around the community schools model, they can tap into children and pull them into the data dashboards and their families into the data dashboards when it comes to health services and mental health services and social support services like food assistance and housing that are being run through the schools. And that was done in a very intentional way, because when the data for the impact deals is collected in school settings under FERPA, the Family Education Privacy Protection Act, it's much less protected actually than HIPAA, which is the health equivalent. So if this data was for mental health or other health services were collected in an out-of-school, informal institutional setting, they would be much better protected. So they need to pull all of that stuff into the school-based settings, or what is going to pass as school once they close down all the schools and turn it into anytime, anywhere learning. In 2017, there was a call by the state government of Colorado for innovative solutions for various nonprofits and stakeholders in the state to advance different kinds of evidence-based solutions for target populations, which at that time included child welfare-involved youth and youth that had been part of juvenile detention programs. So that was happening. Now, a major player in this space is something called Gary Community Ventures. It's led by Mike Johnston, who was a Colorado state senator between 2009 and 2017. He's an alum of Teach for America, and actually he helped found a small school in Thornton that was advancing something called an expeditionary learning model, which for most people who are stuck in, sit down with a Chromebook in a plexiglass cube and do your work, the standardized boring curriculum, like an expeditionary learning model seems like a dream, right? And what most people are understanding is that the intention was you create the problem and then you offer your solution. And so once they get digital identity and wearable technology and smart environments to the point that they have them, that project-based learning out in the environment will get them the next layer of data that they need. So it may seem like a wonderful option, but in reality, it's just creating opportunities for even more intense surveillance of children, digital surveillance, but just in new ways, not necessarily on your tablet or Chromebook. Now, this Gary Community Ventures, it was founded by Sam and Nancy Gary. Sam came out west in the 1950s looking to make a fortune in oil, and he did at the Bell Creek oil field in Montana. He started his philanthropy in 1976, which was originally called the Piton Foundation, and they were focused on social welfare programs and land conservation. So they were doing urban land conservancy, the Denver preschool program, a campaign for children, Colorado children, and then later children's healthcare access. And a lot of the social impact finance space is going to be linked to Medicaid and Medicare and provision of services, but again, as data commodities. So on the website of Gary Community Ventures, where Mike Johnston is currently the CEO, they have been working hard with Governor Polis with his support around something called House Bill 22-1295. And the idea, there you go, Internet of Things, Internet of Bodies, mobility solutions, but conditional if you have your proper QR code. So this House bill is essentially meant to combine all of the early childhood systems into one department. And that's important because they need consolidation to advance the pay for success deals in early childhood. So this is called Better Beginnings Colorado, and I think it's moving forward in March of 2022. On the website of Gary Community Ventures, there's quite a lot of many stories about vaccination in schools, very much in line with the biosurveillance state. They also talk about absenteeism, which is a social impact market. They talk about social mobility of families, also an impact market, and school readiness impact market. So they've got all of these impact markets lined up. And I just want to say, when I was doing some work around sort of this ideal of the one world religion, or sort of this umbrella religion, because to take over the entire world from space as sort of this soft global coup, it's likely going to happen not in a giant militant, military engagement, but they want people just to yield themselves up to it. So it's going to be framed as peace and social justice and love, right? But with data under surveillance. I mean, they're not going to tell you that part. But so I was doing some research, and because of Ervin Laszlo, that Hungarian systems theorist I keep talking about, who is connected with Julia Stolman of the World Institute and the Global Brain Project, Ervin Laszlo was connected with the Baha'i faith, and that's a faith that came out of Persia in the early 19th century, and it combines science and religion. And so what Laszlo has said is that the Baha'i, that's going to be the religion moving forward because of its emphasis on science. And so faith, but specifically steeped in the scientific method. And so, it's when you look in the origins of Baha'i here in the United States, actually one of the earliest providers was supporters and financial supporters was Phoebe Hearst. Phoebe Hearst was the mother of William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper baron, and her husband was a California senator who had made a bunch of money in mining the Black Hills. So Phoebe Hearst, her background, and this is how it all ties in, back to the 19-teens, and this is this long arc, is that she was the founder of the Parent-Teacher Association in the United States, and she and her colleagues were very active around kindergarten. And so, again, at one point in time, I would say, yes, of course, funding kindergarten, full kindergarten funding is an imperative, and we should have that. But knowing what I know about the metaverse and Human Plus and where all of this is headed, really they need to condition the children from these earliest ages. So Head Start, pre-K, kindergarten. And this ties in with the early childhood better beginnings, like better beginnings for what? And I think all of us who, listen to our NPR stations and, read the newspapers, the impact media newspaper stories, think, well, it's better beginnings because we care about children, right? They're not thinking better beginnings because BlackRock needs their portfolio assets put in place. Nobody's thinking about that. They're not thinking, these better beginnings come with surveillance play tables for kids in Head Start, which is happening with EduCare in North Tulsa, in other areas that they're not thinking better beginnings means tracking the social behavior of young children to manage them as human capital into this future of automation and remote robotic work. Nobody's saying when we say better beginnings, we actually mean this, right? And so I think that's really important to consider. So that's Gary Investments. So the other thing is, when we were talking about the game, I wrote a long article focused on Mexico, which is where I think these policies were initially trialed in the early 1990s with Mexican officials, but they were trained in the US at Boston University and at Yale around conditional cash transfer payments. And so this was money, government assistance offered to particularly targeting poor women and their children. And the idea was, economic mobility or providing some stability. But it was conditional, and it was conditional with what was established as good parenting linked to provision of education and provision of health services and wellness visits. And essentially what it happened then is that the whole family gets pulled into the program and comes under surveillance. And whereas in the early to late 1990s, the cloud-based computing, the digital blockchain digital identities were not in place, that was starting to become normalized. And now these programs have spread to like 40 countries, covering millions upon millions of low-income women. Now there's no imperative to actually say, wait a minute. Like the stuff that we're doing globally around this economic structure and debt finance and saddling the countries in the global south with all of this debt and keeping them from being able to be make their own way, that's the problem. And why are these women poor in the first place? It's not because they're not interested in having opportunities to support their family in a reasonable way. It's that it's structured poverty. It's structured that way on purpose, and those women are made dependent on purpose. And I keep saying the frame for me is the indigenous genocide here in North America and the wild, wild west, and the intention of relocating people onto reservations so that they could not support themselves and their cultural practice. So this program of conditional cash transfers is something I hear very few people talking about, even though a lot of folks out there are talking about social control through digital currency. They're picturing like themselves, their middle class, professional class families in their suburban homes are going to be controlled. And that may very well be the case, but it's going to start with the poor first. It's going to start with people who are unhoused, people with mental illness, people with disabilities, and poor women and children. And those children is what they're after. And I hate to say it, I wish the world were different and I didn't have to sit here outside this Capitol and say that. But I can't come to any other conclusion looking at how it's playing out and knowing Palantir is coming to Denver, that Peter Thiel's whole background is in digital payment systems. And so it's important to know that. So in Philadelphia, there's something called the Benefits Data Trust, and it sounds lovely, right? We provide navigators to connect people with the public benefits that they're entitled to, because maybe you're an older person and you don't know how to work the system, you can't get online, you don't know what benefits are available to you. And but it's much bigger than that. They tell a story up front, but they have a much deeper program behind it. And so the people who are behind this Benefits Data Trust, which was launched in 2005, so that's a couple years before the Global Impact Investment Network and social impact investing started to scale through the Rockefeller Foundation. And remember, at that time, Judith Rodin was running it, and she was the former president at Penn. So a lot of this is embedded in Philadelphia, where I live, and many of the connections are specific to Philadelphia. But Colorado is another participant in this program. It's through the Colorado Health Foundation, and their pilot program in 2015 was food assistance to low-income seniors. And people would, and in Philadelphia, the assistant was, heat assistance for low-income seniors, or training, this is our nudge unit, training social workers to be, have better training to deal with intake of the homeless, right? And that was all of the stuff. And it was about water bills, actually. Here, we're gonna create systems that, enable seniors to connect with reduced water bill payments. And you imagine, how could anyone say that's wrong, right? They pick the things up front. You're like, how can anybody say that's wrong? But they're not talking about conditional cash transfers and the larger incursions on people's family and culture and what that will mean. So these are some of the partners in the Benefits Data Trust, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ballmer Group, and that's Steve Ballmer, formerly of Microsoft, and his wife is Connie, is part of Strive Together. That's that cradle to career pathway, right? So if you want the access to those benefits, you better get on the pathway and walk the walk. The Gates Foundation, the Chan Zuckerberg Foundation, that's Mark Zuckerberg and his wife Priscilla Chan. Kaiser Permanente, the health system, they're also deeply involved in Pay for Success finance, especially around housing. The United Way, they run the poverty management program called ALICE for the working poor, assets limited, income constrained employed, that's Alice. The Robin Hood Foundation, which is Paul Tudor Jones, and he worked with Stanley Druckenmiller, essentially spending the last 30 years setting up all of the infrastructure of this as a test bed in Harlem, the Harlem Children's Zone, and Walmart. And again, we've had that conversation in Salt Lake City about Sam Walton and Walmart and his time, at Fort Douglas and supply chains and what all of that means. So, these are the people who want to help, right? But to what end? To what end? That's what I'm saying. So that's the conditional cash transfer. So in 2017 here in Colorado, there was a pre-K social impact bond for with the Westminster Public Schools, which was identified as a low-income school district. The Walton Family Foundation and the Peyton Foundation, now Gary Investments, provided this funding for 112 4-year-olds to participate in pre-K. Now again, if you look at the Salt Lake City Granite School District's social impact bond that was backed by Goldman Sachs, of the 100 children who were screened into the program, only one of them needed special education services at kindergarten enrollment, a number that the New York Times and many people in the philanthropy space said that's a really sketch number. Like that actually doesn't make sense. But Goldman Sachs made a lot of money off the backs of those children. And increasingly what we're seeing is online preschool. And this is this Waterford Upstart program that we've seen in Philadelphia. So keep your eyes out because it's connected to the Sorensen family in Salt Lake City. So these social impact bonds are already happening here in Colorado. In 2019, Hickenlooper had support for these Pay for Success deals for at-risk teens. Remember, 2 years previous, they did sort of an open call for innovative solutions from stakeholders and nonprofits. House Bill 1323 allocated $6 million in public funding, and then there was private funding from Laura and John Arnold and Annie E. Casey Foundation. Now, the Annie E. Casey Foundation has close ties to UPS. It's based in Baltimore. It's a very Catholic charity. Connie, it's connected with Strive Together as well, the Cradle to Career Pathways. And then John Arnold, I mentioned before, former energy futures trader, and that he was the one who was, cutting deals to do aerial surveillance of Baltimore as part of his sort of Better Bail projects and making predictive analytics about crime. And it was covert. It was nothing that the community had buy-in to. They didn't know about it until after it happened. So these are the people who are essentially monitoring or providing solutions for at-risk teens. Now, there were other partners in the program. University of Colorado Denver's Barton Institute for Philanthropy and Social Enterprise, because the academics are all part of this public-private partnership, and the UC Denver Center for Effective Interventions, right? So it's all about evidence-based and what works. And that's what pulls in the conservatives, because on this it is advancing fully bipartisan. So on the left-leaning side, you have people say, okay, well, those in need are being taken care of, right? And then the conservatives say, well, we're willing to pay for it, but only if you can prove that it works. But the what works part means that the people who are delivering the services and the people who are receiving the services have to be under digital surveillance. And whatever supports they receive have to be able to be scaled, which means it's digital. It means it's totally digital. So among the solutions, and there's also, there's the Colorado Evaluation and Action Lab and Social Impact Solutions. So they were helping structure the deals. One of the cohorts was focused on Jefferson County foster care youth. And the program that was funded was called MST, Multi-Systemic Therapy. Okay, so you picture that you have, so some of these are foster care kids and some of them are kids who have been involved in the judicial justice system, right? Some of it is aligning these youth to alternative training and workforce readiness. And again, those are all human capital markets. And again, those children will be directed to build the metaverse, very likely, or perhaps some sort of biotech job or some sort of cyber tech security job, or possibly alternative energy. Those seem to be the areas that people are funneled into. But then also there's the mental health treatment aspect, which touches again on being at Palantir. So this MST therapy is a mental health therapy, and it actually, if you follow it back, it was used in Essex County, England, in the UK in 2013. Okay, and it is a cognitive behavioral therapy. Now, CBT therapy lends itself to digital interventions, like a CBT therapies in VR headsets, conditioning. They're not going to pay for you to have talk therapy with a trained licensed professional. They're going to create some sort of digital intervention or digital nudge or digital training program that they're going to literally program you so that they can get their data for their deal. And that's just the reality. If we accept Pay for Success Finance as this new public-private partnership paradigm, that's how it's going to happen. So MST started in the UK. It was connected to the Government Outcomes Lab, and most of the mental health in the NHS in the UK goes back to Richard Layer's equation around depression. And putting sort of a quantification on, you will provide therapy to someone based on lost economic productivity. Like, not because they're human beings and they deserve it, but you will use the lost economic productivity of mental illness to create the cost offset for these deals. Now, the consultant for this MST therapy, his name is Stephen Goldberg, and he is now with Caffeinated Capital, which is quite the name, but he was the first managing director of social finance, and that's Ronald Cohen, the father of impact investing and Harvard MBA alum. And in 2017, Goldberg actually wrote a paper called Scale Finance, Industrial Strength Social Impact Bonds for Mainstream Investors. Now, does that sound like something that's coming out of a caring place? Like, we care about people's needs? We care about preschoolers? We care about fathers? No. Let me just repeat this. He says, Scale Finance, industrial strength social impact bonds for mainstream investors. They're looking to scale it, all right? That's what's coming. Now, the other piece of this, are you all right? is it's cold here today. We keep going in and out of the sun. The workforce development. Okay, so these are at-risk youth. We have a whole other category, which is training and reskilling, the lifelong learning model on the blockchain. And this will be C-Lab. This will be the Learning Economy Foundation, and it feeds into something called the Colorado Swiss Apprentice Model. Now, this links Colorado to the state of Washington, and this goes through a woman. Her name is Suzanne Levine, and her husband Eric. Now, Suzanne was deeply involved in labor economics in the state of Washington, both in the employment office, in this Career Connect program, in Rework America. She was on the board of the Markle Foundation, which we talked about yesterday. She was involved in finance for the DNC, and she was a bundler for Obama. She was also the ambassador to Switzerland between 2014 and 2017, okay? So when we're talking about blockchain, that's where it all is, the Zug Crypto Valley in Switzerland. So she was very well attuned, I'm sure, to what was happening in the blockchain space in terms of digital badging and the next phase of globalization, which is the remote robotic labor and telepresence labor. Now, they're going to try to tell people that this apprenticeship model is sort of like what we imagined it, right? Like, great, they're going to teach, kids good trades, right, that will help them earn a good living. They're going to have an up-to-date auto mechanic shop. They're going to have up-to-date carpentry, plumbing, and it will happen in schools with trained teachers who know how to work with kids. That's absolutely not what's going to happen. What they're going to do is they're going to put apprenticeship programs in VR headsets. And that's what's going to happen, and you're going to show your competencies, you're going to jump through the hoops, you're going to earn your badges, and you probably still won't get the job because there's 200 other people competing for that job, and it's very likely not going to be things that are actually useful to society. So they're counting on, when you say career and technical education, that most people are going to think about what they imagined when they were younger people, what it meant. That's not going to happen. That's going to be totally gutted, and the teachers are all working at cross purposes because they're not going to be teaching the CTE program. It's going to be mentors, and and some of those mentors are going to be AI and live in a device. Eric Levine, it's kind of odd. They were both with Microsoft, and then he moved on to found an app called Seller Tracker, which was for wine storage. So it's kind of an odd thing that he's doing career-wise planning in Colorado. But he was on the board of CareerWise and the American Swiss Foundation. The funders of CareerWise included the Department of Defense, Department of Labor, United Healthcare, United Way, Walton again, Markle again, the Opportunity Scholarships, Michael Bloomberg, and JP Morgan Chase. These people are in it for the money. The model was advanced by Hickenlooper in 2017, and at that time, Suzanne Levine issued with Switzerland a joint declaration of intent for vocational education. So guess what, Colorado? You're connected to Washington State and Switzerland now. This is moving through something called Skillful. Skillful is, as I mentioned yesterday, the Markles program. It's connected to the Colorado Labor and Employment Division, CareerWise, Colorado Workforce Development Council. Their other partners include LinkedIn, Microsoft. Those are your stackable badges. Lumina, that's for betting on your outcome. For economic mobility, and Purdue. Now, Purdue University, it's important to note that they have the biggest online global university program out there. They also have our host to the Sentient World Simulation with the digital twinning, and Melanie Swan, the crazy lady who's transhumanist in imagining that we're going to have blockchain nanobots run our neurons in our mind on blockchain. These are all in Purdue, right? So Purdue is a partner on this apprenticeship model, which people are thinking something like, oh, great, apprenticeships, like I can be a pastry chef. No, it's not that. It's not that at all. Walmart is also a partner. So one of the other states besides Colorado that's involved is the state of Indiana in Skillful. Now, I will just mention here, there's another program, because people might imagine, well, how will Pay for Success work if the governments go bankrupt? Because ultimately, none of these people are paying taxes, and the governments will go bankrupt. The next phase is something called an impact security that was developed by NPX. One of the co-founders of that came out of Wharton as well, and they've been working on a pilot called The Last Mile, which trains incarcerated people while they are in prison to do coding. So essentially the idea is that people will make more money in prison than they would doing other prison labor, and meanwhile they can undercut the regular market in coding. So that Last Mile program started in San Quentin in 2017, has many major investors. There's organizations called Mission Measurement, Impact Genome. It's all tracking, again, heightened surveillance. And they call these impact securities performance-backed debt for NGOs, and they're all aligned with the environmental social governance. So we can imagine, essentially, the metaverse is not going to be built on properly waged labor. It's going to be built on free labor or subsidized labor, and that's kids, prisoners, poor women, and refugees. That's who they're going to get to the grunt work of coding the metaverse. Now, in order to track you in your digital credentials and your services and the impact, what they need is an interoperable database system, and they will sell it as private and decentralized, but they need to get you on the blockchain to make this happen. Colorado started something called a digital service in 2019. Jared Polis set it up. It's in the the Governor's Office of Information Technologies. And essentially they're there to provide digital services. And they're going to say something like, oh, it's super convenient. It's super convenient. But ultimately, it's about providing the accountability infrastructure for government contracts, for outcomes-based government contracting. Now, the departments that are involved in the state of Colorado are Personnel and Administration, Human Services, Labor and Employment, Public Safety, Public Health and Environment, Healthcare Policy and Finance, okay? So your wellness is all gonna be financed with Pay for Success. That puts you under surveillance with your step counts every single day. And e-health innovation, and that is your electronic health records on blockchain. And we talked a little bit about at the Anschutz Medical Campus. Okay, and so the outside partners include the U.S. Digital Response, the U.S. Digital Service, 18F with the General Services Administration, and that's tech and design consultancy, for the Beek Center for at Georgetown, which is social impact finance, Schmidt Futures, that's Eric Schmidt, formerly of Google Alphabet, and Code for Denver. Okay, so essentially, these are all folks who are going to sell you on the convenience of e-government and digital government. And of course, the lockdowns gave everybody a wonderful excuse to say, hey, you can't access us in person, but you can get us through a portal, right? You need your digital identity. That's where it's going. And so they had a link on their website for past work of this office. So I was curious, well, what were their projects? Well, the only project that was up was essentially managing the contact tracing for COVID, right? So it all goes back to like getting you on the blockchain under the guise of like, if you're a healthy person, you're a national security risk. If you don't have some sort of digital sensor device that says you're okay, that's all part of it. So this feeds to, and I'm just sort of wrapping up here, but the Colorado Digital Identity Program. So, you know, again, in the name of convenience, they're gonna say, hey, you can just keep your driver's license on your phone, you know? Not to mention sometimes like your phone, you know, battery dies or whatever. But that's the selling point. That was issued, the setup for that by Governor Polis by Executive Order B 2019-13. They're using it to regulate, you can use your digital ID for liquor purchases and marijuana. And so I was just telling Jason, like I feel really strongly that the legalization of marijuana and probably at some point sort of controlled psychoactive drugs will be linked to your digital identity, because the mental health system and the wellness, they will want to track the impact of these other kinds of medical uses into their impact deals, right? And so they need that tied to your digital identity. It's law enforcement, okay, and the Colorado State Patrol, that's no surprise, that meshes with the digital driver's license. But they're also looking, and then Department of Revenue, that's linked to your motor vehicle registration. But here we have Colorado WIC, which is, providing food for low-income women and infants. And that goes back to the conditional cash transfer I was talking about. They're regulating natural resources, so parks and fishing licenses. So if you can imagine in terms of the enclosures, they really want people to be dependent, and they want you not to be able to access things outside of these mega region areas, the smart city urban areas. So, I can foresee a day where instead of just the convenience of having your camping permit or your fishing license on your phone, that it's going to be a requirement. Like, you're not going to be able to get into public space without showing that you have the proper credentials, whatever they deem. And for now, they have a vaccine element on this phone. For now, maybe it's the vaccine, but in the future, who knows what other conditional elements you might have to earn the right to access these public spaces. And the last one, and this will sort of, I think, wrap us up, is the Mental Health Center of Denver has patient check-in. And, I'm just in closing saying, it's really hard to imagine, like, we're sitting here in these cities, and on the surface, they all seem so normal. But pretty soon it's going to not feel like, for many of us already, we don't feel normal in these spaces because we know it's underway. But the mental health crises that we had before the lockdowns of the past 2 years are going to be exponentially worse as more people are pushed to have jobs, as more people are put on pathways that don't feel right for them, that feel coercive, as, we become colonized by more and more biotechnology and synthetic biology, both in our bodies and in our environments. They know that there's going to be a lot of mental health, and so they're building the impact markets around that. And they're going to create, my sense is, a lot of alternative wellness providers to service low-income populations and vulnerable populations that fall under this what works component. As I said, you fit all of this together, combined with what I said at the previous site visit about opportunity zones, special economic zones that they can create, sort of these digital company towns, sort of cordon up these communities and put them in essentially a digital game board. And I really, if you haven't watched my talk in Tucson about smart cities and this game, right, this mixed reality video game that is going to be coming with digital identity on blockchain to feed the global brain, pay for success finance, and privatize social services, privatize people. Seriously, my liberal and progressive and leftist friends, please understand that these public-private partnerships are turning the most at-risk people into pawns in something like, the game has already been underway. I mean, I think if you're a low-income person, you know that there's a shitty game out there, and you work through the paces and you hope to survive it, right? And a lot of people don't. But this thing that's coming, the level of coercion with ubiquitous computing, I think it's going to be beyond what we can even contemplate right now. And I don't mean to scare you, but I'm trying to come from the right place. I don't think any of us would want this, no matter where you are on the political spectrum. Even people who are on the conservative side, you wouldn't want to be having your public entities investing in the poverty of other people. You don't want to be a part of that either. People of faith don't want to be a part of that. If you just knew. And right now, it's spell casting what they're doing. They have very, very compelling propaganda to create enchantments that make people think that they're doing the right thing. Whether they're building the panopticon, or whether they're a service provider or navigator in it, or and I'm not sure how we neutralize this other than by awakening to the reality of it. So, Colorado is right in the center. There's some other states, we have friends in Texas. Texas is the center of this. Florida is the center for this. Wyoming is a part of it. Just in closing, I will say, my last thing about Colorado is that the largest digital identity deployment right now is in Ethiopia. It started off with students and teachers, so that would be in alignment with a lot of the pay for success finance that Polis put in the ESSA. but it's in Ethiopia, and this would be connected to education systems linked to the World Bank Human Capital Finance, UN Sustainable Development Goal 4, and that's happening through Cardano. And Cardano, our Cardano Atala Prism, I think, is the component there. And Charles Hoskinson of Cardano, it lives in Guffey, Colorado. According to his LinkedIn, that's what it says. He's working with Carnegie Mellon University, and he's working with Hanson Robotics, and that's Ben Gertzel, that's Sophia and Grace, these humanoid robots that have a shared brain. That's this blockchain brain. And so as poor people, children, at-risk communities navigate this game, all of the data of being human in that game is going to be fed into the blockchain brain, and that's going to go through the impact data fulfillment, which is Ocean Protocol, that's in connection with SingularityNet, which is using AI to move data around to attempt to catalyze conscious machines. And I don't think that they'll actually be able to do that, because clearly machines are not going to have a soul, but I think that they're going to try really hard to capture that in people. And poor people are really resilient, and they're really creative, and that data is the data that they want for their robots, because they want to be able to figure out every different option in this asymmetrical warfare game that they're gonna wrap in spun sugar and lollipops and rainbows and try to sell it to you. So just don't fall for it. Okay, we are here on the outskirts of the University of Houston at the Clinical Research Services area for psychological counseling, and we're here because of a program that's offered in this building on strategic foresight, F-O-R-E-S-I-G-H-T. And I first found out about the foresight process when I was doing education research, and I was investigating Global Education Futures Forum and Pavel Luksha, who is affiliated with Skolkovo Institute in Russia. And he and Tom Vander Ark, who is a Gates Foundation guy, and many others were engaged in this process called foresight, which is looking at signals and anticipated emerging technologies and creating a future forecast of what the future might look like. And within the work that Global Education Futures Forum had done, they had a whole map of the future of education out to 2035 with all sorts of color bands in different areas, from everything from prenatal university to virtual reality addiction, and all of these things in different distinct time layers when they anticipated they would happen. And so when I was doing my early research, people kept asking wow, you must be really smart. And I said, no, but I just found this map, and then I pay attention to the world around me. I pay attention to the news, and it's tracking pretty closely to what these foresight futurists have put together. So one of the local regional programs is here at the University of Houston, and someone whose work I saw early on in education, her name is Elizabeth Merritt, and she is the futurist for the American Alliance of Museums, AAM. And in 2014, I believe, she had done a report for the Henry Ford Foundation on the future of museums in education. Now, I love a good museum. In fact, I used to work for a public botanic garden. I love cultural institutions. But in this document, she had written a chapter essentially stating that the future of education would be that bricks and mortar schools would go away, that we would have this learning ecosystem model that's coming up that is like a Pokemon Go program of going out and doing activities in your community to earn badges, both to show your skills and your behavioral compliance, and that is something that's being advanced by KnowledgeWorks. And that essentially she reflected that schools, bricks and mortar neighborhood schools, were training children for jobs that would no longer exist, and that they were not training children for this future that would be gig economy work, TaskRabbit work, sort of cutthroat work, competing against children from all over the world through virtual reality. And as part of this, there was a separate document that she wrote that was a short story called A Learning Day 2037. And you can look it up, it's an 8-page PDF. But essentially this scenario that was painted, this foresight scenario, described a young girl, Moya, and her brother, Inert. And Moya was like a Hispanic student, low-income student, who was a striver, someone who wanted to do well for herself and her family. She was living in this enclosed community where they did fish farming and grew fruit, but they weren't allowed to eat it. And she worked really hard on her online learning academics with the goal of wanting to be a museum curator, and that she would wander around these virtual reality museums to learn things. But her brother, who actually really very much wanted to be in the real world, rebelled, and he ate the peaches and he didn't do the online schooling. And so that was sort of the narrative that was framed out. And when I read it about 3 or 4 years ago, it seemed so far away. It seemed so very far away, this idea of foresight. But now I realize that it's not so far away. And you know, the COVID lockdowns, biosurveillance have put everything on a fast forward, and that is by design. And so I just wanted to take a moment to stop here at the University of Houston to point out that these things aren't happening by accident, that there are powerful individuals who are trained to do this signals intelligence that will then create futures narratives that they can then send to behavioral, those doing behavioral research, those doing focus group research, who like frameworks that they can then move society's mindset into accepting this reality that is being planned out, a reality of social enclosures and digital surveillance. And University of Houston is a big part of that. We're not going to stop at this site, but University of Houston also has a footprint. They're active in nanotech fabrication, and we're going to focus more on that tomorrow with Rice University and their nanofabrication processes. But the nano space is very much occupied by the University of Houston as well. And it's sort of this false premise of abundance when you create virtual manufacturing with nanotechnologies. And that is all part of this futures building that the foresight people are the pitchmen for. And just in closing, you will notice that this particular building is not looking so great. It's very mildewy and water damaged. And this harkens back to when I was at the episode with the shopping center with all of the graffiti, is that in this future that she is planning out, everyone does wearable technology. And so through your augmented reality, in the short story she wrote, Moya, she had ill-fitting ogles, she called them, which is the VR headset. No one would pay for a Hispanic girl to have implants, these augmented reality implants. But in this future world, essentially, the actual material world starts to look like this, like mold-infested, soggy, prefab buildings. But in your mind's eye, with the wearables, you just make it into whatever fantasy you can imagine. We're right next door to the cemetery, the Fort Douglas Cemetery, and we are at the Huntsman Mental Health Institute that's associated with the University of Utah. So this institute just got a big project underway. There's a major expansion that was announced in 2021. It's a $150 million project, $90 million from the Utah legislature and for inpatient treatment, and then the rest of it is going to be filled in by philanthropy, including the Huntsman family. Now, the Huntsman family, John Huntsman, they have connections to Philadelphia. Both went to the University of Pennsylvania, so they have ties. In fact, the Wharton Business School's primary building is called the Huntsman Building. John Huntsman was the governor of Utah from 2005 to 2009, but he also has a very interesting background as an ambassador, because he served as ambassador to Singapore under George Herbert Walker Bush's administration, and then he served as ambassador to China under Obama, and then he served as ambassador to Russia under Trump. So he's been doing a lot of outreach, shall we say, and then he was also the trade representative. And so once we understand that the synthetic biology, the neurotechnology doesn't really have as much to do with healing people and making people's lives better as to create new markets, to open up new markets where our bodies then become colonized with technology. And that's an economic impetus, and that's something, China has been doing very deep research into AI and artificial brains and neural nets, and Singapore is clearly one of those countries focused on bio-nanoelectronics and smart cities and electronic government. And, Russia has its own stuff going on. The one individual that I have kept track of in the education space, Pavel Luksha, is a transhumanist. And, during the Cold War era, Russia was doing a lot of work around psychiatry and how the mind works, and parapsychology, and a number of different things around consciousness. And so, we see all of these things coming together. It's interesting to me that Huntsman has direct ties to all three of these countries, and has ties to the economics, and then is here in Utah where they're doing a lot of this technology work. Again, we're still in this office park that's affiliated with the University of Utah. So this expansion of the facility to have 170 new beds, but it's also going to include research and a wet lab that they discussed. So this is from a press release last year, and it says that Dr. Mark Rappaport, chair of the University of Utah Department of Psychiatry and CEO of the Huntsman Mental Health Institute, said the new MRI system will lead to new discoveries in the causes of mental health disorders. Quote, "We need a 7 Tesla magnet so we can actually begin to tease apart the brain circuits that are involved in predisposing people to substance abuse disorder or schizophrenia." And he said that will be a shared resource. And so it's interesting, it's important to understand, I acknowledge that mental health and substance and addiction issues cause tremendous harm to many individuals and many families, and come at tremendous social cost. Those navigating all of that is connected to social impact finance. The opioid crisis is very directly connected to social impact finance, as well as mental health. And so we can imagine a day where they start to use predictive profiling of your neurological status through wearable technologies to start profiling you of being at risk of a mental health disorder. And in this moment where all of society is being ripped apart with the fourth industrial revolution, with human plus, with human centaur existence, man machines, people being displaced out of their jobs, many people are going to have a hard time navigating what is it, the quote, being sane in an insane world, right? How do you, that's kind of, it's difficult. So there's going to be more and more people who are going to start to dissent from the changes that are happening. And it seems very clear that with all of the technology that's in place, the digital enclosures, the panopticon, that people who question the overall narrative will be deemed to have disorders, right? And then those disorders will become impact markets. So on top of this, before we leave, I also want to mention, again, this institution is connected to the University of Utah Psychiatry Department. That department has been the focus of quite a bit of litigation over the past decade. One of the programs was called the Autism and Developmental Disabilities Monitoring Network. That was out of the CDC. It came out of the Children's Health Act of 2000. And numbers of centers over the United States were supposed to track autism and developmental disabilities. And it's the largest tracking system of autism in the country. So that one of those institutions was here in Utah, and it was affiliated with the University of Utah Psychiatry Department. The other states were California, Arizona, Utah, Minnesota, Missouri, Tennessee, Georgia, Maryland, and New Jersey. And Dr. Judith Zimmerman was the principal investigator who was managing that project for Utah. And she noticed early on that there were inappropriate accessing of data files on accessing of the data that she had collected as part of this project. And as the responsible party, she was very concerned about who was accessing the data through the University of Utah system and to what end. And so she has filed a number of, she was a speech pathologist, and She was appointed in 2005 the head of this Utah Registry for Autism and Developmental Disabilities. So she was a whistleblower in this, and she tried to alert people in 2012, and then the following year her contract was not renewed. And so then she filed suit because she felt it was her responsibility to raise awareness that the data for these autism networks were being accessed inappropriately. So she has pursued legal courses. There have been a number of damages awarded to her, like a $200,000 award in 2019. There was another one last year. I understand that she still has some more suits filed underway, and so she could not speak to this further. But as we understand, data, as Eric Schmidt said, is the new oil, and mental health data is a means of social control and a means of profit-taking with impact investing. And then you start linking that in with neural electronics and monitoring systems. You can have something that is a very real concern, the concern of addiction, the concern of schizophrenia, or this concern of depression, or the concern of autism, that has really very real consequences, but there's not much of an economic imperative to actually solve the problems. And I think much of this is actually towards shifting humans towards this post-human existence in the metaverse.